Doesn't help that my head wasn't working very well yesterday either. And I seem to be having some live issues today. Like I can't seem to do a couple of things with my live to set it right. So we're just going to go with what we got and try it from there. I wanted to go ahead and just come back in and talk about European ancestry again. We've been back and forth on this one a little bit. Or not back and forth, but we've been talking about this one a little bit. Most of you who know from the very start of me coming in here, a lot of what I'm doing here is, teaching people how to white people better, I guess is the best way to put it, right? And so a part of that is teaching people some information about European ancestry so that they can find space for themselves and find ways to be for themselves. And so in that, learning about European ancestry becomes one of those really, well, first of all, learning about your ancestry is a lifelong quest, not just finding your ancestors. For those of us who already know our ancestors before we go into it, there is still the context of learning the different lives in different time periods, basically, I guess is the best way to say it, right? So like if my time period or if my ancestry is, say, English ancestry, right? Say I have ancestry from England, I do. So if I'm looking through my English ancestry, it's important to note that like English ancestry doesn't mean that you're Celtic and it doesn't mean that you're Anglo-Saxon. It can mean one or the other or both, right? And when it is, one or the other or both, then you have to look at the different time periods. So if your ancestry is English and Celtic, right, to find how your ancestors were living and what the lifeways are prior to the Christianization of the Celtic people, you have to go back further. And then, okay, so Iron Age and Bronze Age and Stone Age, right? All words that the vast majority of us have some recognition of, right? And so when you're looking at that, when you're trying to find out, you might go to the Iron Age. Iron Age Britain is definitely a space that is Celtic controlled, and it doesn't become Roman controlled or outside of Celtic control until about 50 Common Era, when Romans start to try and conquer in that space. And then, of course, Romans leave that space around 400. Yet when Romans leave that space at 400, we see the Anglo-Saxons, the Angles and the Saxons come in. So when we see this, we can look at Celtic lifeways and Celtic thought processes during the Roman era pretty easily. Yeah. Huh. Okay, so give me some more information on these videos, though, Atira, because it's a weird thought process to me that we would resort to cannibalism without it being something that is like a problem, right? Okay, so everything that I have seen shows that resorting to cannibalism comes from a couple of different things. Now, first of all, cannibalism can be a ritual thing, as in when you eat your dead, you imbue your dead, right? And if you are part of specific traditions that believe that you imbue the dead. Now, not all of traditions, obviously, that believe you imbue the dead eat their dead, right? But if you are, is it? Please let me know. I've been having internet issues for the last couple days, and it was issues getting in. Okay, so give me 5 minutes. I'm going to try and restart it and see if restarting it will de-glitchify it. Okay. The right wingers are always scared. Okay, so give me 5 minutes. I'll be right back. 5 minutes. If you're on YouTube, I am still here on YouTube. No, I don't see anybody seeing me on YouTube, so I doubt that there's anybody here on YouTube. I'm resetting la phone. Throwing it at the dog because that's what we do. Throw the phone at the dog. Let's see just how much of this we can do single-handedly. Apparently not enough. Okay, let's try it again and see if it's working better now. Let me know if it's working better now or if I'm still glitchy, please. I'm hoping it is working better now. And it will go on and work better. We'll see. We'll see. Try and get it to. Wait a minute. I'm trying to share it out, and sharing it out doesn't always work as well as I want it to. Okay, cool beans. I've been having a lot of technical issues lately everywhere, so, and because I couldn't get the background off on the other one, I figured I'd just go ahead and put this one on. I'll wait for Atira to come back in though, just so that I can try and answer what she was asking when she's in here. And I did turn off guest requests just because it's hard for me if people pop up in the middle of me trying to talk for me to focus. Sometimes I can do it and sometimes I can't, but sometimes it really like destroys any focus I have and pushes it somewhere else. My brain is not in its best space lately, and so it can be a little bit difficult for me when it's not in its best space for me to stay focused. This is Denny, and if you don't know, we've talked about Denny in here before, but it's been quite some time since we talked about Denny. And Denny was 13 when she died, and biologically she's female. And Denny lived about 90,000 years ago. And Denny's father was a Denisovan, and her mother was a Neanderthal. And she was found in Denisova cave. They had a 2-inch piece of her thigh bone. And that is how they were able to find her. They got the DNA out of that 2-inch piece of her thigh bone. It's actually one of the larger pieces of bone that they have out of Denisovan cave or Denisova cave. And so she she's really interesting in the fact that she's the only one that we have so far that I know of. There might have been more found since Denny, but so far that I know of, she's the only one who is actually half and half of two separate species. We don't see, we see where like you might see somebody who the genetics tells you that like 10 generations ago was the crossing between the two separate species. But you don't see many, you see some skeletons that you can look at and go, okay, that looks like they have some Homo sapien traits and some Neanderthal traits. So we think that they're a cross between the two, but we haven't gotten DNA out of them. And then there's also, things where we can see through DNA evidence of interbreeding like 10 generations ago. But this is the only one that we have. Hello. This is the only one that we have that is a first generation cross between two different species. So Denny is pretty powerful in the fact that she is our first generation cross between two species. And again, those two species being Neanderthal and Denisovan, her father being Denisovan and her mother being Neanderthal. It's important to note that we haven't found any Neanderthal Y DNA, like the chromosome, the Y chromosome out of Neanderthal. We have found that the Neanderthals that we have found that we say are genetically male, the Y chromosome in them is either a Y chromosome from Denisovan or a Y chromosome from Homo sapien. And so we actually haven't found Deniso or a Neanderthal Y DNA yet. We haven't found a Neanderthal Y DNA anywhere yet, right? We haven't found it in either us or in any of the other species or even in the Neanderthal themselves. We have only found other Y DNAs within the Neanderthal. I think we might have upped our amount of Neanderthal skeletons. Let me look really quick. I'm typing one-handed. But I believe that, so we don't have a whole lot. We have 400 individuals with 30 relatively complete skeletons. So this means that we don't have a whole lot of Neanderthals. I mean, we have more of Neanderthals than we do of many of the other species out there, but we still don't have a whole lot of Neanderthal, right? And of those that we have found, we haven't been able to DNA test all of them. DNA testing for ancient DNA is still relatively new. It's only about 10 years old, right? We see that polymerase chain reaction was adapted by Sponte Pablo around 2010 to actually be useful for ancient DNA. We haven't been able to get a whole lot of ancient DNA out of them yet. And the ones that we have been able to get ancient DNA out of, we see that, and I think, and I don't remember how many we've actually gotten DNA from. I know that there's not a whole lot. I know that it's relatively low. I want to say it's roughly 20 that we have been able to get DNA out of. So I'm going to use 20 as the thought process because that's the one on the top of my head. But that doesn't actually mean that it is just 20. We might have gotten DNA out of a couple more. That could be a little bit. Oh, I'm sorry. Is it still glitchy up on you? It could be that we've gotten more since then, but I remember the number of 20. And so out of the 20 that we have gotten DNA out of, we have gotten 4 that are actually showing Y DNA. It's still glitchy. Oh, you know what? Let me try something. It's a new phone, and so I have been using it differently. Let me see. I just put it on the actual house internet because I've been able to not use the house internet on it. And let me see if putting it on the house internet actually helps. Give it just a minute to settle in and see if it actually helps. And Atira's back in here, so I can go ahead and talk about cannibalism a little bit. Hey, beautiful. I'm not doing guests today just because my brain is too discombobulated and it will take me off somewhere else and I won't be able to actually string words together because I'm having a hard time stringing words together. Just so you're aware. So when we're looking at cannibalism, a lot of course, the right wingers are out there deciding cannibalism is prevalent. So Cannibalism in the form of I kill people so that I can eat people is, I believe that there are a couple of communities that have been found that do that as a whole over the course of the entirety of human history. I think there's like maybe two or three um, that are literally killing to eat, right? And I would state that most of those groups and communities aren't really animalistic or animistic communities. They are definitely communities that are indigenous to the area that they're in. Like we're talking, nations that were found like 100 years ago, right? We're not talking about anybody currently, right? Yeah. So there's not any communities outside of those very narrow relative few. Then most of the communities, because I haven't studied cannibalism in an entirety and in depth, right? It's not something that is a focus of area on me. I have seen a lot about it and I've studied some of it, but not like severe focus on it, right? Um, so I might be a little bit off on some of the knowledge that I have. I just want to put that out there forefront. What my memory serves is that I can only remember of three communities that were cannibalistic in nature, and the three communities that were cannibalistic in nature, as in I kill to eat human, were all island communities. They were all on islands where there's not a lot of outside food sources, right? So it becomes one of those things that it's more about other things than it is about just eating humans, right? It's more about dearth, right? A lack of something. And that again is it's from my recollection. I could be slightly off on it. That's just my recollection. We do see cannibalism in other areas, right? So when we look at most of the cannibalism that we have seen throughout history, almost all the cannibalism that we have seen that we talk about, like the Donner Party, things like that, that isn't specifically one person going out and harming others, like Dahmer. Is cannibalism out of necessity, right? So cannibalism out of necessity means Donner Party, trying to cross a pass, get stuck in the winter. Half of them die of starvation and freezing, and the other half choose to eat the already dead. They're not going out and killing people to eat them. They have bodies that they can't bury because the ground is frozen solid and they're starving. And so they decide to eat the bodies instead, right? And so that is cannibalism out of necessity. Cannibalism out of necessity isn't an evil, right? It's a survival, right? Now, I mean, first of all, you're not killing somebody, you're not harming somebody. Cannibalism out of necessity in these kinds of instances are not harming. They're starvation. Most of the people that have died that are being eaten starve to death. You will even run into cases where people who, are in situations like that will say, listen, if I die, eat me so that you can live, right? Yeah. And that's true. When we get extreme and think about negative things about our fellow man, we fight more because we really believe that it's okay. We really believe that we can, it's not going to be harmful to others to fight, right? Um, well, I don't think the Sentinelese are cannibalistic. I don't remember the Sentinelese being cannibalistic. I could be wrong, and I'm just not remembering it. Um, but I don't remember them as being cannibalistic. Now, again, that could be wrong. They could absolutely be cannibalistic, and I'm just not remembering something within it. Um, but I don't remember them being cannibalistic off the top of my head. Um, and I'm not seeing anything about cannibalism within the Sentinelese. In a quick look, again, this is just a quick look because I'm just pulling stuff up and trying to find it, um, within a quick so that I can give information, right? But my remembrance of the Sentinelese is they're not actually a cannibalistic group. They kill people, right? Who try and come to their island, but they aren't like out. So the Sentinelese, I mean, they might kill those who come to their island and eat them. I don't know, but I doubt because of how small that they are as a group that they're really killing each other just because. of the fact that they're intentionally isolated, and they're such a small group as it is, right? At this point. Um, Now, I could absolutely see that they might have, because we do not know a whole lot about the Sentinelese. What we do know about the Sentinelese was is something that happened early on. Like um, early on, there were people who go to the Sentinelese, uh, who were studying the Sentinelese, and then, of course, they are acting barbaric, and in their acts of barbarism, the Sentinelese decide to no longer allow people outsiders on the island, right? uh yeah, the isolation makes a notion. They could, if there is reports of cannibalism against their own people, they could absolutely, and we've talked about this a couple of times, so let me get to this point here. There are many groups of people who believe that by imbibing the dead, by eating the dead, whether the dead is a deer, a rabbit, or another human being, you take on the spirit of the dead. And when you're taking on the spirit of the dead, like you'll find people who believe that by eating the heart of a lion, they're capable of not excessive, but that huge pet predatory instinct, right? The lion instinct, right? So you're going to find that there are groups out there that believe in imbibing the dead and getting the spirit of the dead. And some of those groups, not all of those groups, because there are many groups out there that believe that you are what you eat, right? You imbibe what you eat. Um, some of those groups who believe in imbibing the dead believe in imbibing their own human dead. And they believe in imbibing their own human dead because by imbibing the spirit of their ancestors, they can continue the spirit of their ancestors, right? Now, I'm going to give you. So I read about this in an Anne Rice book the first time I read about that. And I read about that in so the start of vampirism in the Anne Rice books. The two sisters who start vampirism actually belong to a nation of people who eat their dead. And after I read about that in the vampire books, I went, wow, I wonder if that's real. I think I might have heard something like that before. I wonder if it's real. Let me go and do some research. And so that's where I learned about imbibing the dead as an actual practice and not as just a fictional practice in Anne Rice's books, right? Yet the thought process and the theory of imbibing your dead, because of the fact that you believe that the spirit of the dead carries on in their body if you imbibe them, and therefore carries on within you, is a cultural practice in some cultures out there. I personally wonder myself if some of the reasons that we believe that burial of dead doesn't start until when we know burial of the dead starts based on burial finds, right, is because of other methods of caring for your dead. And some of those other methods of caring for your dead could be some indigenous nations today method of caring for their dead, or when they were colonized, method of caring for their dead was to leave them out, right? We've all heard or seen images of the trifles, the scaffolds that some nations of Turtle Island will put their dead on so that the elements can actually take them away, basically. I wonder if I sometimes wonder if maybe the Neanderthals had a practice like that, right? And that's why we don't find burials until later on. I also wonder if sometimes wonder if Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens had a practice of imbibing their dead. We do have a couple of finds that support Neanderthals eating dead Neanderthals, which would absolutely be support of either that thought process or the thought process that we've talked about, or we were just talking about, where if I'm starving and I eat the already dead that has been starving, then I survive a little bit longer, right? So I personally, when we look at the thought processes of Neanderthals eating their deads, I kind of go back and forth between that. To me, I think that the evidences that we have of Neanderthals eating other Neanderthal dead comes from the thought process of either starvation or of the eating of the dead as a cultural burial practice, right? When we're looking at those are really the only instances that I see of as eating the dead within both archaeology, anthropology, and in history, because I've studied history before I studied archaeology and anthropology, right? So in my studies within history, archaeology, and anthropology, all the instances that I have found, um, again, I think that there are imbibing. Sorry, question in YouTube. So imbibing, as in like, you know how like you imbibe alcohol, like you drink alcohol. Let me look up. Taking on the soul of would be, um, I think it's E-M, imbibing. I think it's I-M. Let me look it and see if I can find it. It's I-M-B-I-B-E. And basically it's to take in. So it's absorb or assimilate. So so absorbing the dead, so absorbing the spirit of the dead. Yes, absolutely. Oh, of course, absolutely, totally understand, and always, always, always down for that, Cynthia. Absolutely. So, hey, Savage. So with that, what we're looking at is the idea that by eating the dead, you are ingesting their spirit. You're keeping them with you. That's what it is. It's you're keeping them with you. You're ingesting their spirit. You're taking their spirit within them. Sometimes you're looking at, usually what you're looking at is the children, the grandchildren, the family members, when it is a spiritual part of death ritual. And it's the family members who are taking the spirit of the person who passed on. If you're looking at somebody who might have been like a priest or a priestess, somebody who might have been a connection for the entire community, it might be something that the entire community partakes in. And in the practices that I have read of or seen of or heard of, what you're looking at is basically it's a feast of the dead, right? It's basically you cook your dead and you eat your dead, basically. So this is probably not probably, this is the most common evidence of ritualistic cannibalism, is the eating of your dead, as in a ceremonial way of keeping the dead with you. Again, I know of probably three. I've heard of probably three, and I couldn't even give names. Okay. I just know that there are like three probably nations that I can remember from like the early 1900s through history books. And again, I mean, these are history books, so who the fuck knows? It's written by white men, talking about island indigenous nations who practice cannibalism. Now, just like we were talking about with the Sentinelese, if you are isolated on an island, practicing cannibalism is a little less likely, right? If you are two separate groups isolated on an island, cannibalism might be more likely. You're unlikely to eat your own members of your community other than eating the dead. Like you're unlikely to kill and eat your own members of your community to survive. You might kill and eat members of another community to survive if you are in a low food area, right? So yeah. And so when we're looking at true cannibalism, right? True cannibalism being cannibalism, as in I go out and I hunt and I kill a person to eat that person. We're not seeing a lot of that. Every evidence that we have has been extremely isolated cases, as in singular cases doing this. And what it was just off of a question, Savage. And every instance that I've seen, and again, I've only seen 3 instances of true cannibalism, or heard of 3 instances, and all of them are, honestly, I don't know any of them that I could absolutely say for a fact that weren't created by white men to cause fear, right? That doesn't mean that it doesn't happen. It doesn't mean that it didn't happen. I just don't see a whole lot of validity in it. I do see a lot of validity. Like, okay, so when we look at the Neanderthal find that is a juvenile leg bone and an arm bone, I think, or something like that, that have cut marks and teeth marks on them. Or I think it's just cut marks, actually, not even teeth marks. What we're looking at, and the cut marks are the type of cut marks. So when we are when you're stripping bone, if you've done any hunting, right? If you've done any butchering of an animal, they're the type of cut marks that you see when you're stripping bone, when you're stripping meat off a bone. And so this leads us to believe that this is a case of cannibalism within the Neanderthals, right? Now, when we look at this case of cannibalism within the Neanderthals, again, we're seeing two, I think, maybe three bones that show evidence of being eaten by another human. It is believed to have been Neanderthal because it's believed to be a Neanderthal site. And what we're seeing is not something that shows evidence of violence to the bones prior to death, right? Or death causing violence, right? So, of course, the bones that we're seeing aren't necessarily bones that you're going to see a lot of death causing violence on. Long bones aren't really something you're going to see a lot of death causing violence imprinted on. You can, but it's not, normally if you're trying to kill somebody, you hit them over the head, not stab them in the leg or the arm, unless you're just unskilled. So my take on that, the evidence with the Neanderthal, from what I've read on the evidence within Neanderthal, and I think we have 2 sites that we have found in total that have some evidence of that, but I cannot recall if I'm relating one of those sites with the Erectus Paranthropus site that's also showing that, right? If we're looking at this, what I've seen from it or what I take from the site is that we're looking at either a case of starvation where you're eating the dead because the dead died and you're starving still, or a case of ritualistic uh, uh, eating of the dead so that you can imbibe the spirit. And again, when I look at the fact that we don't have burial for humans and Neanderthals prior to a certain time period, I often wonder if there were other death rituals involved that just weren't actually interring them in the ground with items, right? And then when we're seeing cannibalism outside of that, the cannibalism that we see outside of those 2 instances are cannibalism events like the Donner Party. And again, the Donner Party, and we have about 2 or 3, I think one was a plane crash that did this as well, instances where people are trapped in high mountains where they have no access to any food and people are freezing and starving to death. And when people are freezing and starving to death, that freezing and starving to death, people will eat those who have already frozen and starved to death to stay alive. And again, and I think it was actually in the plane wreck one, there's a plane wreck in the Andes Mountains, I believe it was, where this happened as well. And I think it was actually in the plane wreck one where the people who were dying literally told the other people, listen, eat me when I'm dead, like stay alive. Yeah. And it was like, eat me when I'm dead so that you can stay alive. Right. And so when we're looking at that, what we're looking at is survival. We're not looking at cruelty. We're not looking at harm. We're looking at survival. I would like to let you know that if you eat your dead, do not eat the brain of your dead, because eating the brain of your dead is what actually will cause insanity. When we eat the brain of a human, it will actually cause us to go insane. It causes a disease process to start within our brains, right? So it'll actually cause us to be insane. So if you ever reach the point where everybody's dying around you and you have to eat your dead, don't eat the brain. And I don't know why. I know, yeah, like I know why. Like I've heard of it, and I know I want to say it's like a worms or something like that that gets in the skull, but it could be something different, and I'm just remembering it wrong. Like it doesn't sound right to me. So I'm not exactly sure. I don't exactly remember exactly what it was that causes it, but it is the eating of the brain. So for those who are right wing, who are thinking that we're going to devolve into cannibalism, cannibalism is something that comes out of more of an evolutionary process. Like we're more cannibalistic today than we have been any time in human history, right? We as an entire society are more cannibalistic today than we've ever been in human history. It's very cannibalistic to feed the poor to our government, right? To look at somebody else and go, well, thank God it's not me. He's starving on the streets. It's a very cannibal, and then walk into Starbucks, right? It's very cannibalistic. Yeah, yeah, mad cow. Yeah. And so when we're looking at, I mean, not like there are some people out there literally eating and hunting and killing the dead today during modern times. And we're not seeing evidence of people out there like serial killing, hunting, and eating the dead. I mean, the Countess of Bathory, maybe, But even that is a lot more modern, and that's a civilized culture. So when you're dealing with people who are on the right, who are sitting here telling you that things are going to evolve or devolve, remind them that cannibalism, as we know it, only happens in modern day civilized society. Cannibalism, true cannibalism, only happens in civilized society. We don't see true cannibalism in other societies. Like I said, there's been documentation of about three indigenous groups that I can remember of. And yet, the documentation of those three indigenous groups was done by white people. And it was done in the late 18, early 1900s, which means that the level of truth versus propaganda in it is a huge question, right? So if you've got people out there who are telling you that, if we move further down this path towards, reclamation and reconciliation and, change, that it's going to devolve into that, I would ask them, well, first of all, I'd remind them that the Catholics seek their dead every Sunday. And second of all, I would remind them that, hunting and killing people to eat is kind of a modern thing. And it really comes in a society that tells you that others aren't as important as you, that you can devalue another human life to the point that you can devalue the earth, to the point that you can devalue the animal, right? So it's not something that you're seeing in primitive, which I hate that word, but we're talking to right wingers, right? So in primitive groups, it's not something that you see, but it is something that you see in civilization, right? Um, does that cover it? Do you have anything else within that you have questions on, or that I might know that I can help you with so that you can utilize it later, Levity? Because I want to make sure that I've covered, because that, you know, dealing with that shit. Um, I'm trying to think. And I think that's pretty much all that I can. You might now have a question that will actually like put it in my brain a little bit differently, and I might be able to answer it. But I think that's pretty much all I have. Um, and I think it does tie into some of the stuff behind us on the wall, right? We're looking at a period of time currently where we are working so hard on devaluing everybody else around us so that we can turn everybody else around us into meat, right? And we're working so hard on othering, which we've talked about in here frequently, the idea that the barbarians in the hills are coming to steal your grain. So you have to pay the mob boss so that he can protect you. Um, and when we live in a society that has taught us to devalue life on any scale, that devaluing of life on any scale makes it easier for us to not only kill, but to harm, right? Not killing isn't necessarily a violent act. And what do I mean like that? Um, if I'm going out and hunting and I'm killing a deer, it's not a violent act, it's an act for survival. As long as my hunting of the deer is not done in cruelty or in harm to that deer, I'm not dealing with a violent act, I'm dealing with an act of survival. It's no more violent than going out and chopping down a tree, which would be an equally violent act against another species, right? It's no more violent than pulling a plant out of the ground by its roots, which would be an equally violent act causing the death of another species and another being, right? So, uh, this idea that we can dehumanize other species on the planet and dehumanize us and dehumanize the land is what leads to this violent thought process that you can do these things. And when we look at things like cannibalism, they very much come out of that kind of dehumanization of the world, right? That shift from an animistic thought process that tells us that everything has value and everything matters around us to the idea that only you matter, that self-centric thought process. And so we can see with the rise of violence, with the rise of, that thought process, that rank and hierarchy actually are important and have this somehow magical quality that makes some human beings worth more than other human beings, right? Um, that really bleeds into that violence and into that ability to harm, right? Um, when we're looking at um, how we see that rise of violence coming about, we were talking a little bit about this yesterday, and we were talking about how the shift into Western agriculture happens, what is currently thought of as to why that shift happens, and the impact of that shift on the mental health and the physical health of humanity. Right. We went into it slightly on the fact that, now you're looking at, instead of maybe working 2 hours or 3 hours a day to provide for your community, you're working from sun up to sundown, right? Instead of always having enough, right? Because gathering actually gives you enough, right? Gathering, you know how to store your food, you know how to keep your food for later. Gathering usually gives you enough. There are, of course, periods of starvation, a great drought, a great flood that has, killed off all the things in the area, or things like that might actually cause a period of starvation. Weather changes, shift in space, things like that might cause a period of starvation. But a period of starvation, A, is for the whole community, though you are ensuring that any food goes to the weakest and the strongest among you. Know, what do I mean by that? So if you are experiencing a period of starvation because you can't get food, but there's food out there, but it's just hard to get, you're going to make sure that those who gather and those who hunt, those who go and get the food, are going to be those who have enough food to sustain yourself, so that you can go out and spend those extra calories to try and come back and give more food to more people, right? Um, you're also going to see that the elders and the children within the community are going to be fed first, because of the fact that it is understood that the elders and the children within the community um, don't have as much storage of fat on their body, don't have as much storage of calories, and have a higher need of that food to sustain themselves. So when you're looking at a period of starvation in a hunting, gathering, or gathering, hunting lifestyle community, what you're looking at is a period of starvation that is shared by the entire community. And in that period of starvation shared by the entire community, what you're seeing is that the community is ensuring that they do their best to care for the entire community still, right? They're not, um, it's a communal thing still. It's not like you're watching, you're starving while you're watching somebody else eat this huge meal, right? And that is a huge difference on the psyche. It's a huge difference on the psyche if you are watching somebody live in abundance while you are starving. It's a huge difference, right? So when we're seeing this early farming starting, and we're seeing this early practice of Western-based agriculture, again, it needs to be understood that agriculture is prior to Western. Agriculture does not mean monocrop. Agriculture means interaction with the plants, right? Interaction with the plants around you. So agriculture is also honorable harvest, right? Tending is also agriculture. When we see the shift of agriculture go from tending and honorable harvest into a shift that gives us Western-based agriculture, what we're seeing is, first of all, and we've talked about this before, if I have a plant, camas, camas is an amazing plant, and it grows in wetlands, right? And it's a root-based plant, and there are different, camas has several different aspects of camas that you can eat. Camas is a really good plant for you. If I am growing camas because it's in a wetland that it grows in naturally, right? And I go out and I get enough for myself, I get enough for my family, I get enough for my community. We make sure and store some of the harvest at the end of the year so that we make sure we have camas year round. Camas is growing in an environment that camas was meant to grow in. Camas is growing in an environment that has a large cross productivity and a large cross nutrients. There are plenty of fish in that environment. There are plenty of waterfowl in that environment. There is plenty of crawdads. There's plenty of small animals living within that environment whose feces are providing nutrients. There are plenty of other plants in that environment that the chemicals that plants give off, because the chemicals that they yeah, I think chemicals is the correct term, but the chemicals that they have, that they produce, help the other plants. This is why we talk about the three sisters. We see corn and beans and squash all planted together, because their chemical signatures that they give off actually fertilize nutrients. Thank you. The nutrients that they give off the signatures that they give off, they actually cross fertilize each other. They cross nutriate each other, right? Not cross fertilize. Well, yeah, cross fertilize, not pollinate. Cross fertilize each other and cross nutriate each other, right? So when you're looking at camas being grown in camas's natural area, all of the wildlife and all the plant life in that area provides nutrient to the camas, right? When you are taking camas out of that area, and say I want to take camas out of that area and I've decided I'm going to grow camas in my backyard. I go out, I get a pool, put some dirt along the bottom of that pool, put the camas in, cover it with water. That's supposed to work, right? Yet I have taken everything from the environment that provides nutrient for the camas. I've taken away the entire biome. I've taken away the entire ecosystem. And by doing that, I rob the camas of the needed nutrients for camas to actually develop further. This is the same thing that happens when we see any form of monocrop agriculture. You see the removal of that plant from its natural habitat and putting it in an unnatural habitat, right? In a habitat that does not traditionally support it. Now, even if you're talking about, so wild wheat and wild barley grow all along the Fertile Crescent, grow all along the Levant area. These things are there. Yet when you're looking at wild wheat and wild barley, you might see a patch that's like a 5 by 5 foot patch. And among that patch, you're going to see several other plants within that patch. You're also going to see several other animals interact. And that 5 by 5 patch is going to be surrounded by patches of other plant life. Now, if instead I decide to take a piece of land and I take everything out of that piece of land, all of the other plant life, because I want to just grow barley. I don't want anything else but barley. And I go to that 5 by 5 patch where the barley was growing, and it was growing very healthily because it was in this broader ecosystem, in this broader biome. And I take it home and I try and put it in this patch that has nothing else to provide it from nutrients. I have to provide it from with nutrients morning, noon, and night. And so instead of a tending-based honorable harvest, which actually provides more nutrients, provides more sustenance to the community because of the fact that I don't have to go out there and actively work every day on a singular sustenance, right? That sustenance is growing on its own, that it's taking care of itself, that my going out and taking some of it prunes it, it helps it grow better, it helps it grow back, yet it is not me providing 24/7 care. When you take the barley out of its environment and you put it in this raised patch, right? This patch where you've taken everything else out of this patch, what you're doing is you're putting it in an environment where it doesn't have the other nutrients. So now you have to provide full care. Now, a lot of this comes about, they believe in what they call the Younger Dryas. And the Younger Dryas is like a 1,300-year period, which is basically a cold snap. And in this 1,300-year period, that's basically a cold snap, environmental changes meant that people had to shift how they were doing things. In this middle of this cold snap, many of the plants that were growing before are no longer growing. Many of the animals that are prevalent are no longer prevalent because we're in this middle of a 1,300-year cold snap. So in the middle of this, we see what we believe to be the rise of Western-based agriculture on a communal level instead of or not a communal, but like a city, broader communal level, right? Instead of seeing the Western-based agriculture that we see first along the Nile, which again, as I've said in here before, the Nile is a space that every year floods, and so it replenishes the nutrients in the area. So monocrop agriculture is actually okay along the Nile because it's constantly got a replenishment of nutrients. But pulling it out of that area and making it not just one sustenance farm. So we have evidence that there were many sustenance farms starting around 14,000 years ago, right? And these sustenance farms are one, and it was mentioned, clan is a good word for this. I try and avoid certain words just because I know that they can be used, they've been used against people, right? But one family group, so clan is probably the best thought process with it, but one extended family group holding one field, have a couple of houses around this one field. They're feeding their entire community from this one field and the few animals that they have, right? And they're probably still hunting and they're probably still gathering in a few different ways as well. We see though that during this time, as you're shifting from, dad, I've got a group of 30 people and 10 go out and hunt and 10 go out and gather and the other 10 stay at home. and the 10 that are out hunting or maybe out for a few hours in the morning, and the 10 that are out gathering or maybe out for a few hours at the night, and the 10 that stay at home are tending to the community right there in the home. What you're seeing is instead of a couple hours a day for sustenance, you're seeing from sun up to sundown. And you're seeing that instead of a yearly ability for sustenance, you're waiting for the harvest, right? You have to wait for the harvest every year, and then you have to store from the harvest every year, right? So you spend most of your year starving. Really, your best time of the year is during the fall when you're harvesting your plants. Through the rest of your year, it's a very hard scrabble existence. To me, this is where we see the rise of violence happening. And the reason is because, as I've stated before, species don't develop with things that are toxic to the species as a natural part of the species. Species develop with things that are healthy for the species as a natural part of the species. Toxicity comes in from outside factors, from environmental factors, from different factors that are happening in their environment that cause a shift, right? So if we're looking specifically at early farming and the way we see that early agriculture translates from single farm, sustenance based small communities to larger agricultural based cities or larger agricultural based communities that aren't just a singular family group, what we're looking at is no, let me rephrase that. When we're looking at a time when the shift goes from small communities taking care of each other to a hierarchical based larger community like a city based on agriculture. What it seems that we're looking at from the research that I've done is humans who have grown up in a traumatic environment and it affecting their behavioral patterns. Now, I refer to this as the narcissistic God Kings. Anybody who's been here for a minute has heard me say narcissistic God Kings 100 fucking times. This to me is the narcissistic God Kings. Now, why do I call this the narcissistic God Kings? One of our first kings is Sargon, or at least documented, right? And again, prehistory is everything before cuneiform, and history is everything in cuneiform or syllabic writing afterwards. So like prehistory in Turtle Island is considered before 1492, even though there are many forms of symbolic writing in Turtle Island before 1492. They just don't consider it because, white people. So prehistory is before this. Our first histories, one of them is Sargon. And Sargon is supposed to have been the king that founded a great city. Oh God, I can't remember if he's Assyrian or fuck. Off the top of my head, I can't remember. And the book's over there, and I always have a hard time finding it in the book. But Sargon starts as, and we'll all know this story. Sargon is an infant who's abandoned, put in a basket, he floats down the river. He's pulled out by a farmer, and the farmer raises him as his child. Sargon is the child, abandoned child of a deity in Sargon's mind. He is the abandoned child of the river goddess, okay? And because Sargon is the abandoned child of the river goddess and he was raised by this farmer in a life of hardship and trauma, Sumerian, it might be Sumerian. I can't remember if Sargon is Akkadian or Sumerian. Because Sargon is raised by this farmer in a circumstance where there's dearth, where there's not a lot of food. He's raised in a hard scrabble struggle. Now, again, we're talking about a time period where people are going from a gathering hunting lifestyle that is not a hard scrabble existence. Hunter-gatherers do not live a hard scrabble existence. Agricultural, Western-based agricultural farmers live a hard scrabble existence. So we're talking about a time where other people around them are not going as necessarily through as hard scrabble of an existence as they are. We're talking about a child who was adopted by somebody who is farming who is doing farm labor. You don't have a child on your farm not doing labor when, everybody needs to do labor to make sure that the harvest comes in, right? And everybody is working from sun up to sundown. And we are not talking easy labor. If you've ever worked on a farm, if you've ever had a garden, you know that this is not easy labor. It's back breaking. It's hard physical labor, right? So he is doing for a adopted father hard physical labor from the time he is a child. He decides that he is actually the child of a god. And when he becomes an adult, he gathers together like-minded people around him and they form the first city, right? He becomes king of the first city. Now, it's already a community, it's just not a city. And when you see this becoming king, you see him gathering people to him. So, what you're seeing in anything that I can see today in psychology is a childhood that is almost created to create a narcissistic thought process. MPD and megalomania and psychopathy, which are the three parts of the dark triad, right? These are often created because of a traumatic childhood. The traumatic childhood is almost always as followed: abandonment by one parent, being raised by somebody who is not your parental unit, and the person who raises you being abusive in some way, shape, or form. Now, I'm not saying that Sargon's adoptive father was abusing him by making him go out and do farm work. They were farmers, right? And yet, if you're in the middle of this hardscrabble of existence, but you're watching other people not in the middle of this hardscrabble existence, or, somebody is actually not kind, we're not hearing whether or not his father is kind, right? Then it is very, even with his father being kind, his stepfather being, or his adoptive father being kind, the existence itself is a traumatic existence, right? So these things have a tendency to create narcissism. Symbols or signs of somebody being narcissistic is believing that they're the child of a fucking deity. Like, that's called a god complex. And on the list of things that are signs of being narcissism, it's up here. Like, I'm the child of a deity is like top of the list of what it is to have a god complex, right? Like, that's like you just right up here. God complex, narcissist. You got a god complex, you're most likely a narcissist, right? So we have somebody who has had this hard scrabble, very painful childhood that has abandonment within their childhood, who decides that they're the child of a deity. This is very, very obvious narcissism, right? This is very, very obviously MPD to my mind. Now, I am not a psychologist. I've known a lot. I've been through a lot of talked to a lot of psychologists. I'm not a psychologist. I've dealt with a few narcissists in my life. I have a few narcissist family members, so I have a lot of information about narcissism. But again, I am not a psychologist. I'm an anthropologist, right? This to me, though, appears to be narcissism. So you see that within narcissism, there is the need to maintain power, and there is the need to isolate, and there is the need to convince you that I'm not the problem, that or you or something else is a problem. If you weren't acting like that, I wouldn't have to treat you like this, right? So when we see Sargon taking over as king of this area, gathering people together and convincing people that they should be paying him and his troops so that he can protect them. Now, of course, if you have a time where you're already experiencing as a global whole a lack of food because of the fact that there's a climate change happening, right? The barbarians in the hills are probably absolutely raiding some of these small farms, right? And absolutely, there is probably a need for several of these groups to get together and maybe form walls around their community. There isn't a need to pay somebody to protect them, but there is absolutely a need for protection. Yet we do see, and this is understood through most archaeologists and anthropologists, that this is the start of othering. The barbarians in the hills are going to steal your food, so you have to pay me so that I can pay soldiers so that the soldiers can protect you from the barbarians in the hills. So give me your food. I'll steal it instead, right? We see that this othering translates down. We've talked about this one a few times before. We see othering goes from the barbarians in the hills to now everybody's in nation states. And so it's that other nation state compared to us. After it's the other nation state, it's that gender compared to my gender. Females are weak. After that, it becomes a religious thought process. Before it becomes a religious thought process, religion is like, I have my gods and you have your gods. Your gods and my gods are probably pretty similar. We're not hating on each other so much for each other's gods. And if we're moving into each other's space, I can always equate the fertility goddess that you worship with the fertility goddess that I worship, right? Even the Romans, you see that Isis is a major goddess in Roman mythology because of the fact that Rome, in their conquering of Egypt, did not eradicate Isis. They just adopted Isis, right? So we see that before monotheism, there is an understanding that, everybody's gods are okay. So we don't see othering based on gods as much. There's probably a little bit when we see gods like Baal, where everybody's killing their children. There's probably groups out there going, wow, that's fucked up shit, right? Yet there isn't entire civilizations who are othering based on that. There's not entire civilizations who are going, oh my God, they're pagans, so they're going to kill us. They're devil worshippers, right? So we see that othering then goes into religion. Of course, we then see othering goes into race in the 1400s. And then after othering goes into race, we now see othering in things like immigration and houselessness, right? In all of this stuff, we see that it traces back to the barbarians in the hills are coming to steal your food. And that traces back to the need to provide a level of control over you so that I can continue to subjugate you, so that I can continue to keep you in your place, feeding me, right? And again, to me, this starts with this shift. Now, to me, as I was saying earlier, and this part isn't just to me, we don't see species speciate with things that are toxic to species. Species get toxic things for their species within them based on environmental factors. So, this environmental factor creating narcissism, megalomania, psychopathy, Machiavellianism, not megalomania, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy, right? This creates we know a little bit about epigenetics, most of us now. And epigenetics is the imprint of something that's happened to your ancestors, creates a change within your genetic structure. So if this imprint of what happens to Sargon changes his genetic structure, this introduces the dark triad. Now, I can't tell you whether he was a narcissist, a Machiavellianist, or a psychopath, right? It looks like narcissism to me. I'm going to stick with narcissism. When we're looking at this, this creates a shift, right? It takes the genetic information that's already there and it perverts and twists the genetic information that's already there because of the epigenetics. So this creates a shift into a toxic gene within humanity. This toxic gene within humanity then gets passed down. And I've talked about this one before when we look at the fact that for the last 10,000 years, your surest way of making sure that your children ate, had nice clothes, and had a roof over their head was to marry up, right? If you're in the dirt, you're going to marry higher so that you can eat. So if everybody is working, right? If everybody is working to marry up so that they can eat, they're marrying into these royal families. There's very few people left on this planet that do not have an ancestor who belongs to one of the royal families. Now, there are people within Turtle Island and in Abiyala that are not the children of European kings and queens, right? Pretty much anybody with descendancy outside of the Western Hemisphere is related to a king or queen that you know of in history. Genghis Khan is like responsible for a third of the world's population, or 3%. It's a 3. 3% of the world's population. I apologize. Genghis Khan is responsible for roughly 3% of the world's population. Roughly 15% of all people of European descent are descended from Charlemagne, right? When we are looking at those of European descent, almost everybody of European descent is descendant of a documented king or queen. Now, that doesn't mean that people in Turtle Island or people in Africa or people that indigenous groups in other areas aren't descendant of kings and queens. It just means that we don't have a documented king and queen in those areas that they're descended from, right? So when we're looking at that, we see that this happens because it's going to happen less in areas that are communal based that actually feed everybody in their community, right? But in areas where you have rank and hierarchy within population, you're going to see that people are marrying into the hierarchical levels that you are going to be stable in. You know that you're not going to be stable in the hierarchical level of your poor sustenance farming. So you're going to marry a guard. You're going to marry a soldier because you know that there's going to be more stability within that, right? So to me, and I've mentioned this one before, this is where we see narcissism, Machiavellianism, the dark triad really start within humanity. Again, it is a toxic part, like it's a toxic thing to our societal as a whole, to our species as a whole. Therefore, it is not something that starts within us. Without it, it's not something that's natural to the species. It's something that has to be a perversion, a twist, a toxicity within the species, right? So when we see this, we definitely see that this rise of violence correlates with this rise of narcissism and this rise of hierarchy. And again, we can see that this rise of violence correlates with this use of othering to get you to think that everybody else is a problem and I'm not the problem. It's not me stealing from you, it's everybody else stealing from you, right? And again, we see this roughly 10,000 years ago. I think that the papers that I've seen on it say 12 to 10,000 years ago. And it talks about the fact that there's roughly 2,000 individuals in the skeletal or in the archaeological record prior to that time period. And of them, roughly 2% have things that could possibly be attributed to violence. I always want to clarify that. Possibly attributable to violence means if I see a hole in somebody's head that they were obviously hit in the head with a rock, I can't tell you if they were hit by another human with that rock or if the rock fell out of a cave or the rock fell from an overpass or the rock fell on them, right? Or maybe they fell and hit their head on the rock, right? I can't necessarily see that. So we see things that are possibly attributed to violence at 2%. And then 10,000 years ago, we see that that possible attribute to violence goes definite. This is absolutely violence. And we see it rises to 18 to 20% within the finds that we have. So when we're looking at this rise of violence, and we see this rise of violence spreading across the world, we see this rise of violence spreading across the world with the same idea of Western agriculture, right? With the same idea that Western thought is the prevalent thought, is the necessary thought to survive. The great cosmic mother. I'm not exactly sure. Like, is that a specific great cosmic mother, or are we talking about like Mother Earth? Just to ask. And then when we see this rise of violence and this spread of violence starting, right, what we're seeing is as long as I can get you to hate somebody else, I can get you to hurt them, right? Again, this goes back to what we were talking about initially with Tira, that, cannibalism isn't necessarily something we see unless it's something that's a need, right? I.e., you're starving to death and somebody's died, so you eat them because they are already starved to death. Or i.e., I'm taking on the spirit of the dead because I'm carrying on my mother, and so I'm going to eat my mother, right? We don't really see a prevalence of it. We don't see a prevalence of violence. I have not read it. You know what the date is on it, Kelly? I'm pulling it up right now. 87. I'll have to take a look at it. I may have read it. I mean, it's old enough that it might be something that was handed to me and I just don't remember it. Um, it is definitely looks like something that my mother would have absolutely have handed to me. The woman handed me Clan of the Cave Bear after all. Um, so it is possible that I have already read it, but it does not. I'm not sure. So I'll have to check a look at it and see. I have read When God Was a Woman, which is also along the lines of it in when you're looking at it, apparently. But I don't know if I've read that one specifically, but I've got it up. It's 1987. But I've got it up. I'll take a look at it and see if I can get a copy of it. So when me too. I am at 1,067 followers, I think, and I am already getting reports all the fucking time. Like all the fucking time. Like I don't even know. Like and like none of my I have been so careful. So careful with my content. Like I am so careful to not even come across in any way, shape, or form like I am being angry at you, right? Like, so that maybe I don't get reported for bullying and harassment. And yet, still, I'm getting reported for bullying and harassment. So, we'll see how long this account stays up. I'm trying to cross platform, but it's hard for me to cross platform. I don't think I can go live on Insta. And I don't think that I can well, I know I can do live on Facebook, but Facebook is a little bit of a different platform. So it's not so much something that I can get the follow or like the reach. Like it doesn't have the reach that some of the other platforms do. And I find that videos for me, I can't get enough information in the videos. Like even a 10-minute video, the way I talk is really difficult for me to get all of the information out in a 10-minute video because I'm talking like somebody asked me a question, right? Thank you so much. And so I'm worried. I'm like, I don't even know what to do at this point. Like we just might end up, I mean, we've got some TikTok or some YouTube people, but the problem with YouTube is that there's not a lot of chat in YouTube, and the chat actually keeps me going. Having more people in and having the conversation actually keeps me going and makes it easier for me to actually like. So hopefully we'll be here for a minute. When we are looking at that rise of violence, we definitely see that it starts then. Before that, we're not seeing violence really in the archaeological record. We're not seeing this level of hate, right? So with that, let me go ahead and kind of backtrack on my list, okay? Because we kind of went into violence because we've been talking about cannibalism, and we went into it first, but we were also talking about violence yesterday first, and so I want to make sure that I'm also getting into some of the other things on my list. And so let's go ahead and start with the species, because I know that this is a fascination for everybody, right? Ghost species, what the fuck are they? What are the other species that we see that we live alongside us? What do I mean by cousin species? So let me go ahead and go into those a little bit just so that we can get some information. I think that these are really important, and especially really important and prevalent when we're looking at indigenous groups around the world and their statement of indigeneity in Western academic circles, like my ability to state, yes, I'm indigenous in Western academic circles, basically. So yeah, I believe that 100%, Lisa. I totally believe that. I mean, it just, well, and I'm pretty sure mine was the watermelon shit. I think mine was the watermelon shit that really took it out. Yeah. Well, and I do agree with that, Cynthia. Teaching that capitalism isn't natural, that rich people aren't better or deserving, and most people get banned for that reason, right? And that's real. I think that that's a lot of it. That there's a lot of people out there that you can't handle the truth. Let me go all fucking Jack Nicholson on you. You can't handle the truth. You don't want the truth. You can't handle the truth. So I think that there's a lot of people out there that just can't fucking handle the truth, and their inability to handle the truth means that they shove their heads in the sand as much as they possibly can until they can, harm others, because they're still on that harming others path, right? They're still on the thought process that that's the way to be anyways. So when we look at the ghost species, first let me let you know what a ghost species is. This is not something I think that a lot of people understand. It's getting a little bit more mainstream understanding these days than it used to, but it's very new in the mainstream understanding. we saw fragments of things that were different in our DNA from the very beginning. And when we were able to do a whole genome of the Neanderthal DNA, we were able to see that certain of those fragments of our DNA were actually Neanderthal DNA. Myself, I have the dark skin illegal for Neanderthals. I have dark skin alleles in my body that are Neanderthal dark skin alleles, and I have light skin alleles that are Homo sapien light skin alleles. Right? There's about 9 skin tone alleles. And Neanderthals had all the alleles as well. Neanderthals varied in skin tone, just like Homo sapien varies in skin tone. So I personally have an allele for dark skin that is from the Neanderthal genome, and you can see that chromosome, right, that allele, that genetic marker matches the genetic markers of Neanderthals. So all of us have genetic markers. We have a full genome. And in our full genome, all of us on this planet have other genetic markers in there. Now, with the exception of 2 nations within Africa, everybody on the planet has genetic markers for Neanderthal. Doesn't matter where you're from, doesn't matter where you're going, it doesn't matter. Everybody on the planet, with the exception of the Yoruba and the Kwe, have the markers for Neanderthal genetics within them. They have Neanderthal genetics. They have 1 or up percentage of Neanderthal within that goes from like 1 to 5% of Neanderthal. And this is prior to colonization. This is in finds prior to colonization. So you're looking at skeletons 10,000 years ago in Africa, and those skeletons, unless they belong to the Yoruba or the Kwe, are going to have markers for genetic information for Neanderthals within them. We did a full genome spectrum of Denisovan 2010. We did a full genomic spectrum for Denisovan in 2010. And once we did that full genomic spectrum for Denisovan, we were able to see that there were genetic markers within Denisovan that were genetic markers within us. And so this tells us that we have genetic markers from Denisovan that we got from Denisovan. Now, the people that we can see across the planet that have genetic markers for Denisovan within them are the people of Southeast Eurasia, or of Asia, Southeast Asia, right? From like the Tibetan area down, basically. The people of the islands of the South Pacific, the people of Australia, and the people of Turtle Island and Abiyala. They all have genetic markers from Denisovan. The highest amount of genetic markers for Denisovan are in the Guinea people and in the Australian indigenous people, and those markers are 5 to 6%. The lowest amount of markers for Denisovan in our genetics for Denisovan in us is within Turtle Island indigenous people, and other than 0, obviously, within Turtle Island indigenous people and Abiyalian indigenous people, and it's 0.02 to 0.03%. The 0.02 to 0.03% tells us that we actually lived with Denisovan for roughly 10,000 years before we came to Turtle Island and Abiyala. Because of the way that the intermixing happens, because of the fact that and this is kind of changing right now. So we might not be understanding the way that we're intermixing with Denisovan and Neanderthal, or how easy it is to intermix with Denisovan and Neanderthal correctly. So as we're changing that understanding, that might change a little bit. Currently, though, it is believed that for the 0.02 to 0.03% that we see within Turtle Island indigenous people and Abiyalian indigenous people, this means that we were with the Denisovans for roughly 10,000 years on our way here, basically. They recently brought out, they discovered Atlantis. Basically, Atlantis is Australia. And Australia had this broader continent around it, that it was a much bigger continent. There's a couple of different thought processes with it. But the islands of the South Pacific and Australia, all of this space had much more land, right? So it is quite possible that in our movement to Turtle Island and Abiyala, the time that we spent with Denisovan was in the South Pacific, right? These are the 2 that we have found full genomes of the species in the fossil record. They're the only 2 that we have found DNA from in the fossil record so far. They're the only 2 ancestors that we have DNA from in the fossil record. We have our own, but we do not have DNA from any of the other finds that we have in the fossil record so far. The only ones that we have DNA from are Neanderthal and Denisovan. Now, this has a lot to do with environment, okay? We talked a little bit about this yesterday, and we've talked about this before. DNA, like every other chemical, has a half-life. Like everything else on this planet, even you hear even tin has a plastic has a half-life, right? These are how long it takes something to degrade by half, right? Half-life. So if something's half-life is a day, and there are, I'm going to use DNA and I'm going to use numbers that are arbitrary. This is not the correct numbers. If you have 100 strands of DNA, and DNA shrinks, it doesn't disappear, just so you know. But if you have 100 strands of DNA and your half-life on DNA is a day, then the first day after death, because once death starts, once you die, the cells in your body stop replicating. Until you die, the cells in your body are consistently and constantly replicating, right? So once you die, the cells stop replicating. And when the cells stop replicating, the DNA starts degrading. The half-life, and again, these are not the DNA numbers or the DNA half-life. It's just off my head. If the half-life of DNA is a day and you have 100 strands of DNA on death, then that first day you lose 50 strands of DNA. And the second day you lose half of the remaining 50, meaning you lose 25 strands of DNA. And the third day, you lose half of the remaining 25, which means you lose 12.5 strands of DNA. So because of the way DNA, like everything else on the planet, degrades, and because of the fact, like everything on the planet, degradation actually changes by environment. So if something is an extremely cold, dry environment, it will take much longer to degrade. It will preserve it for much longer. If something is in a very hot, wet environment, it will degrade rather quickly. And if something is fully submerged in an acidic environment like a bog, you're going to see that they can last a lot longer. Or like the tar pits, right? If they're fully submerged in something like that, you're going to see that they last longer, that the DNA, the bones, whatever it is, last longer. So we have found bones currently of 7 other species on this planet that lived alongside us during the same time frame that we were, that we look at as our cousin species, not species that we descended from and not species that we created. Erectus is a species we descend from. Heidelbergensis is a species we descend from. We have species that we lived alongside of that came from those species, and so they're kind of like our cousins. Of those 7 species, though, the only ones we have DNA from are Neanderthal and Denisovan. So currently, the 7 species that we have found in the fossil record, one was just found a couple of months ago, and the current 7 species that we have are we found Neanderthal in the 1850s. We've known about Neanderthal forever, right? In 2003, so 21 years ago now, we found Florensis. Florensis is our hobbit species. Lord of the Rings is a real story. Florensis is our hobbit species, right? And Florensis is on the island of Flores in Indonesia, and we only have about 50 of them that we have found. And they're a small species, 3.5 at their height, and they have large feet, right? And they hunted pygmy elephants. They're kind of a cool little species. After Florensis, we didn't find another species until we found Denisovan in 2010. And of course, Denisovan is found because in Denisova Cave, there's all of these fragments. I think there's like 25,000 fragments in Denisova Cave. And none of them are larger than like 2 inches. They're just like, I mean, just fragments of human, just so many fragments of human. And they're all human bones to our knowledge, but we don't know what human bones, right? So we're starting to test them because we were able to do a full genomic testing with ancient DNA on Neanderthal. Cannot remember the name of the person who invented polymerase chain reaction, but the person who utilized polymerase chain reaction for ancient DNA is Pablo Sponte Pablo. He won the Nobel Peace Prize last year. And he won that because of the fact that he was able to get a full genome out of Neanderthal, and because he was able to modify or adapt polymerase chain reaction to be able to do that. Polymerase chain reaction will take a fragment of something and of DNA, and it'll multiply it millions of times. And when we test DNA, we destroy it. And when we test the strands themselves that we plucked out, we destroy that strand in the texting. So polymerase chain reaction gives us the ability to test these things. So Denisovan is found in 2010 thinking that they were testing Neanderthal bones. They come up with a whole new species. We're talking about a phalange, a fingertip. And this is how we find Denisovan in 2010. In 2012, we find Homo naledi. Homo naledi was just all over Netflix, Cave of Bones, like the unexplained Cave of Bones. Really amazing species. The species is 335,000 years ago to 235,000 years ago. It appears that they had art. It appears that they had burial. It appears that they had a lot of things that we and nobody else had at the time, right? There's no other evidence of burial at the time. There's no other evidence of art at the time, not in any other species. Naledi is pretty impactful and pretty significant. They're 2012 in the Rising Star Caves. Rising Star, Naledi is star in, I do not remember the name or the language. I don't remember if it's actually Kwe or if it's actually a different language. I want to say that it's Kwe, but I cannot remember. So Naledi means star, and when we find them, we name them after what we find them in. Like Neanderthal is Neander Valley because tall means valley. So Neanderthal was found in Neander Valley, and so we named him Neanderthal. Denisovan was found in Denisova Cave, so we named it Denisovan. Naledi was found in the Rising Star Cave of Johannesburg, South Africa, so we named it Naledi. After Naledi, we realized that there is a species that a skull that we have is a new species. We realize we've had the skull since the 70s. We take another look at it and we go, "Ooh, this is a different species." Now, we don't have a skull cap of Denisovan, so there is debate as to whether or not this species is actually a Denisovan skull or it's an entirely new species. This species is called Longi. Longi was found in the Long Cave in China. Long means dragon. You'll probably have heard this one referred to as the Dragon Man. After we find the Dragon Man, or we decide that the Dragon Man is another species, very shortly after that, we find Luzonensis. And Homo luzonensis is on the island of Luzon in the South Pacific. And it is a dwarf species. I think its height is 4'8", is the tallest that it gets. I do not think it has big feet. I haven't seen anything on that yet. I just know that its height is short. It is our dwarf species. So Neanderthal, Florensis, Naledi, Denisovan and Naledi, and Longi, and Luzonensis. This is 6 species. 2 months ago, they published a paper on what we are calling HLD6 right now. HLD6 is Holongdong Cave, and HLD6 is the 6th. We named the number is the burial number, right? Like, so Shanidar 1 is the first Shanidar cave burial that we pulled out. Shanidar 2 is the second Shanidar cave burial that we pulled out, so on and so forth. This is the 6th burial out of this cave that they pulled out. HLD6 appears. So I'm curious on HLD6. And the reason that I'm curious on HLD6, and I'm working on looking into this more, it's a new species. We don't have a whole lot of information on it yet. We haven't gotten DNA. If they have, we haven't released any studies, or they haven't released any studies on it yet. HLD6 is the only other species that we have found that has the flat face that we have. It appears to have some Homo erectus traits still, Homo neanderthal traits still. Some of these traits we do not have. So there's a gap between the last tooth and the curve of the mandible here. There's a couple of other things. Hold on a second. There's a couple of other things in it that appear to be Homo erectus, but there are a couple of traits within HLD6 that look like us. And it is 300,000 years ago, which is the same point that we see the first of us in Africa, in Morocco, because the oldest that we have is 300,000 years ago of us is 300,000 years ago in Morocco. This is another redating, another re-examination of an old find. So Jabal, and I don't remember the name on it, but Jabal in Morocco was an old find, and they re-examined the dating, and they realized that it was 300,000 years old and not a modern Homo sapien, but an ancient Homo sapien. So at the same time frame, we're seeing a similar species in Asia. So I'm kind of looking into this a little bit more. I'm not exactly sure what all I think with this. A part of me is wondering. So when we look at the oldest species of Homo sapien that we have in Africa, we're not looking at somebody who looks exactly like us, right? We're looking at somebody where the chin is started to form. They still have a low brain case, and they have no gap in their molar, and they have the flat face. I don't know if that's all the different signifiers for Gerode, but I don't remember all the signifiers for Gerode. Um, what we're seeing within HLD6 is similar. What we're seeing is the start of a chin. The chin isn't fully there, but if you look at HLD6, and they are on my website, I do have that information on my website. You can look at the skull and the chin on HLD6, and you can see where the chin is starting to form, and they have a flat face. These are things that are very Homo sapien only kind of things. And so it's kind of interesting to see a species at the same time that Homo sapien is in its very earliest start in Africa, um, that looks exactly like that very early start in Asia. Um, and that's 300,000 years ago. And so that's our seventh species, and that's the one that we just found. So when we were just talking, we were talking right before I went over the different species, we were talking about how we see imprints of some of these species within us. We see Neanderthal DNA within everybody on the planet except the Yoruba and the Kwe, and we see Denisovan DNA in significant amounts of people. And we see that because we see DNA in us that is not Homo sapien DNA. It's absolutely terrestrial DNA. Please don't take the ancient aliens route on me. But it is not Homo sapien DNA. And it's like a little gene here, a gene there, gene for oxygen, a gene for skin, a gene for, whatever. It's a little gene here and a little gene there. And we don't know because we haven't gotten a full genome of that species yet, what that species is. And so we call this a ghost species. Now, we have 7 that we found ghost species. We have 5 species that we found in the fossil record that we don't have DNA from. It could be that some of those 7 species are those 5 in the fossil record. May never get DNA out of them. Naledi is in a warm, wet environment. Florensis is in a warm, wet environment. Luzonzensis is in a warm, wet environment. Longi, we haven't been able to get DNA from at all. And HLD6, we don't know. It's another warm, wet environment. We might get DNA, we might not, right? So when we are looking at these 7 ghost species, we're seeing just little fingerprints of species that we haven't found the genome for. Again, that doesn't mean we haven't found them. It just means we haven't found their genome, so we don't know it's them. The 7 that we see 3 in those 2 populations in Africa that do not have Homo sapien DNA, or Homo sapien, Neanderthal DNA. We all have Homo sapien DNA. The 2 spaces in Africa that do not have Neanderthal DNA, the Yoruba people and the Kwe people, they have 3 ghost species in them. They have 3 species where we don't know the full genome of the species. We haven't found them in the fossil record yet, but we can see the fingerprint of them in the Yoruba and in the Kwe people. We have 1 species that we have found in indigenous Australians, and we have 1 species that we see in indigenous Turtle Islanders and Abiyalians. We have 1 species that we see in Neanderthal and Denisovan, but we do not see in us. We have 1 species that is new, and I do not know where they're getting it. The same article that put out about HLD6 also put out about a new ghost species. I do not know if this new ghost species is in Asia. I do not know what population, like, is this new ghost species in Neanderthal and Denisovan, or is it in Homo sapien? They just put out that we have a 7th ghost species. So currently we have 5 that I can tell you where they see them in us. Again, the Kwe and the Yoruba people have 3. Turtle Island indigenous people and Abiyalian indigenous people have 1. And we see that Australian indigenous people have another one as well. So again, ghost species are ones that we see little fingerprints of them in our DNA, but we haven't found the full genome of the species yet in the fossil record. So we call it a ghost because we don't know their name, right? We don't know who they are. And we won't be able to find out who they are unless we can find DNA of them in the fossil record. And at which point we'll be able to find out who they are. Unless, they come up with some new way of mapping DNA. It's always possible, right? They now are able to map our DNA and tell what we look like from our DNA, specifically, like not just what color, hair, and eyes we had, but whether or not we had a specific shape of a nose or whether or not we had a specific shape to our lips. They're able to now map those things in ancient DNA. That's how they were able to get Denny behind me. The reason that Denny looks like this in this picture is because from that small little piece of her leg bone, they were able to get enough information in her DNA to be able to tell you her eye color, her hair color, and what her bone structure would have been like to some extent. Um, Denny is 13 years old. There is understanding these days, a newer understanding that we actually used to create our own sunscreen on our skin. We would release oils, and the way that our skin flakes off, between a combination of the oils and the way our skin flakes off, would kind of provide this layer over our skin that would kind of sunscreen us, right? And so it is thought that the reason that they made Denny look a little bit older like this is because that layer of oil and skin cells that they have, right? And so that's why Denny looks a little bit older than us, or a little bit older than the 13-year-olds we have today, right? Um, so these ghost species that we're seeing give us the ability to not just understand that there are other species out there that we haven't found yet, but it also kind of that, and where we see Denisovan and Neanderthal also gives us a little bit of understanding of migration patterns of the early species out there, right? So say we look at Turtle Island indigenous people. We can see that Turtle Island indigenous people spent at least 10,000 years, as the current understanding, with Denisovan. And again, this is at some point on their way over here. We're seeing that Denisovan is seen in the DNA of people in Southeast Asia, seen in the DNA of people. The most of it is seen in the DNA of people in Australia and in the islands of the South Pacific and Guinea. And we're seeing that Denisovan isn't really seen anywhere else except for within us, right? And so because of that, we can see that we spent about 10,000 years intermingling with Denisovan on our way over to this space, right? Now, we can also see with the ghost species that we see in Turtle Island indigenous people and Abiyalian indigenous people that this is a ghost species that's only seen here, which tells us that there was a species that we came in contact with in this migration pattern that nobody else came in contact with. Now, I personally have related this to this Rudy Macedon find and the Hill Local find, and I said Cactus Hill last time, Calico find, the Calico find in Calico, Texas. So these finds are all predating the current understanding of even Homo sapiens leaving Europe, or not Europe, even Homo sapiens leaving Africa, right? So when we're looking at these finds, what we're seeing is, let me pull up these are all on my website under Rewriting Western Hemisphere and under Pre-Sapien Finds. So we have the Heel Loco site in Vasaquillo, Mexico. I am butchering that, and I apologize every minute of my butchery. And this one has 3 datings on it. We're looking at 25,000, 250,000 years ago, 800,000 years ago, or 80,000 years ago are the 3 datings on the Heel Loco site. The Calico site in California, not Mexico. The Calico site in California is 2,000 or 200,000 years ago. The Calico site was worked on by Leakey, and Leakey helped date this site. So, I mean, people are going to tell you that it's wrong. It is one of the things that Leakey was given shit for part of his time, but we are talking about one of the, most famous archaeologists and anthropologists of all time when it comes to paleoanthropology, and, deciding to disqualify what he states about a site because it doesn't fit the Western idea of what is going on. And it might, mean that maybe you're doing a little bit more damage than you have excused yourself from doing. Makes total sense. Not really appropriate, but makes total sense. And then, of course, the one that we've talked about a few times, which is the Cerruti Macedon site. This is a 130,000-year-old site. It is, there is no question on this site. Like, there are people that are questioning it, but none of the people that have questioned it have actually looked at the evidence from the site. They haven't even talked to the people that are studying the site. Like, they have no firsthand knowledge on the site. They're not debating it on any evidence. They're debating it on, I don't want it to be like that. They're debating it on, that doesn't help my white thought process, right? And so you could debate it all you want, but if you haven't actually looked at it, if you haven't actually talked to the people who have done the study, and you haven't actually looked at the bones from the study, and you aren't actually listening to the people who have done the study, all your debate is meaningless. So all three of these things are going to be, or all three of these sites are going to be pre-sapien sites here within Turtle Island. Again, we see our earliest sapien find is in Africa currently, in, I think it's Jebel Irad is what it's called, in Morocco. And that site is 300,000 years old. It is currently believed, though, that we don't solidify as a singular species until 135 to 125,000 years ago, right? Now, what does that mean? So our current understanding, this is a new understanding, is that two species on this planet have come about from what we call speciation through convergence. Now, usually speciation happens from isolation. Usually speciation happens because one group is isolated from the rest of their group and they adapt to an area. And because they're isolated for such a long period of time, their adaptations make them a new species, right? You can usually breed back to the other species for a few, 100 years, a few 100,000 years, right? But after a while, you can no longer breed back to the other species. Speciation through convergence was thought of until this year as being something fantastical. It was thought of as being a theoretical method of speciation. Nobody thought that it could really happen. It was just a theory. And then in this last year, they realized that Homo erectus speciates out of speciation through convergence of Australopithecus, Lucy, and Paranthropus boisei, the Nutcracker man, and Homo habilis. And so instead of coming directly from Homo habilis, it's coming through those species converging, breeding with each other, mating with each other. And so then about, 1.7 million years after Homo erectus comes about, we see that Homo sapiens starts coming out of the same thing. We're seeing that we believe it's Heidelbergensis ancestor ergaster and Homo erectus are converging to make us. Meaning that I might be a Heidelbergensis with an ancestor and an erectus parent, and I marry, or I have children with an ancestor who has an erectus and an ancestor parent, right? And so between the two of us, we have like 5 different species in us, and we have a baby, and that baby appears Homo sapien. These first Homo sapiens are literally based on the appearance of the skull more than anything else. And really how we define what is Homo sapien and what is not in the fossil record has to do with the chin and the flat face. We are the only hominins that we know of that have a flat face until HLD6, and we are the only hominins that we know of that have a chin, right? And so we define what is Homo sapien and when the start of Homo sapien is by those 2 features. We call these basal. They're only within us. So we believe that in a couple of different areas of Africa, species are converging, and those convergences of those species in a couple of different areas in Africa is what is creating the newer species coming out. So you see that the Morocco find is 300,000 years ago. We see another one at 260,000 years in Ethiopia, and another one in South Africa at 260,000 years. And so these are 3 different spaces where this species is starting at the same time. But it doesn't become a singular species as in we're all living in a singular community, or we're breeding with other Homo sapiens instead of breeding with Heidelbergensis, right? It doesn't become that until 125,000 years ago to 135,000 years ago. By this time, we're already in what was at the time Northwest Africa, though is currently the Arabian Peninsula. And we're already intermixing with Neanderthal. So when we look at finds in Turtle Island that are prior to 100,000 years ago, those finds in Turtle Island that are prior to 100,000 years ago are not sapien finds. They have to be another species of hominin. More specifically, because we're looking at finds that have tool usage, they have to be another species of hominin that used tools. And all species of hominin that use tools after Paranthropus boisei are Homo species. Homo erectus is the only species that makes it outside of Africa. And we see that Homo erectus makes it outside of Africa at 1.8 million years ago. And all the other species that we see outside of Africa come from Homo erectus, speciating in different spaces outside of Africa. So when we see finds in Turtle Island that predate Homo sapien but are obviously Homo finds, what we're looking at is when Homo erectus is making it across the globe, as they seem to have done, they also make it to Turtle Island and Abiyala, and they speciate here. They become another species here. My theory on that, my hypothesis on that is we're looking at the giants, and my hypothesis on that is that as we do everywhere else, as we move into a space that has other people within it, we're looking at people that seem to have all been small in their genetic numbers. What do I mean by this? Um, when you have a genetically narrow group creating a new species, that species is going to be genetically narrow. Genetic narrowness actually kind of causes inbreeding and causes death of the species. Like a species will die if it's too genetically narrow. It doesn't have enough genes to sustain it. And so when we're looking at these species that we have come across, we're coming across species that by the time we come across them, they're very small species. When we look at Neanderthal, by the time we're interacting with Neanderthal at, we start interacting with Neanderthal at roughly 150,000 years ago. There is evidence that we're interacting with Neanderthal slightly before that because there is evidence of Y DNA of Homo sapiens and Neanderthal before that. And as we're interacting with Neanderthal slightly before that, we're seeing that intermixing already starting. Yet we know that by 100,000 years ago, Neanderthal had shrunk as a species. It was never a large species to begin with. It was never, they say, and this might have changed in the last year, but they used to state that Neanderthal was probably never fought more than 500,000 as a species whole. Like over the entirety of its time as a species, there were probably not more than 500,000 of them, right? Now, this may have changed since that information was given to me, or since I learned of that, that was something came from a professor. But since then, we have actually realized that Neanderthal were here another 100,000 years because they pushed back the dating on Neanderthal to 600,000 years ago. And we've also realized since then that Neanderthals went through two almost extinction events where they shrunk their species. By the time we are meeting up with Neanderthal, the last of the Neanderthals are roughly 10,000. There's roughly 10,000 of them. So by the time we're meeting up with them, we're seeing that they're mating with their cousins and their nephews and nieces, and they're mating with their family because there's no genetic diversity left. And so when we meet up with them becoming enveloped within us actually saves their species. Neanderthal is still here. There's more Neanderthal DNA on the planet today than there was when Neanderthal was a species whole. And Neanderthal is still here because of the fact that Neanderthal, being so genetically narrow, used the outside genetics of Homo sapien to continue. When we are looking at all of these other species, we're looking at similar things. We're looking at species who speciated out of a smaller group of Homo erectus. If I have a group of 100 Homo erectus who make it to East Asia, and a species speciates out of that group of 100 Homo erectus, the species that speciates out of that 100 Homo erectus is not going to be a very large species. It's going to be a smaller species because of genetic drift, because of the narrowness of the genetic diversity. So by the time you're seeing Homo sapiens making it to many of these spaces, they are looking at a species that is a cousin species. It's important to note here that we're never looking at these other species as being different like we do now. We look at them as very similar to us. So they're looking at cousins and they're like, oh, hey, well, you look like you could use some new daddies, right? Like you look like you're low on some new dick. So we're intermixing with them. I prefer to term it as enveloping species within us. As we're moving across the planet as Homo sapien, we're enveloping the other cousin species that Homo erectus left behind within us. So when we look at Turtle Island indigenous people and Abiyalian indigenous people, and we see that there is a ghost species in Turtle Island indigenous people and Abiyalian indigenous people, and we see that there is evidence of a species in Turtle Island and Abiyala prior to Homo sapien, what we're seeing is the most likely scenario being that Homo erectus makes it here, Homo erectus speciates here, and then when we get here, we envelop that species that is already relatively small within us. And so this gives us, especially when we're talking as Turtle Island Indigenous people, as Abiyalan Indigenous people, many of us understand the constant debate of, well, you were only here for 10,000 years, so there's nothing wrong with us taking it from you anyways, right? You can see that there is not only proof that we were here longer in many other areas, but there's also proof that part of us comes from a species that actually speciated here. So from before before Homo sapiens species. So that being said, we can track how long and I don't like individuality, uniqueness of of our DNA here in this area through that, right? And that's, I mean, to me, the biggest use of that is in the argument of, well, you were conquered, or you weren't here that long anyways, right? Or you're not indigenous, we are. The erasure speeches, right? Um, and we also see that within Australian Indigenous people. We see that Australian Indigenous people, first of all, Australian Indigenous people are the longest community outside of Africa. Australian Indigenous people have been in that space and have had civilization in that space for 70,000 years. And we see that Australian Indigenous people have highest there's okay, so I have seen 6% Denisovan for Australian Indigenous and 5% Denisovan from Papua New Guinea. Yet I've also seen that New Guinea has the highest amount of Denisovan DNA, so it's a little bit back and forth on it. I would state that Australian Indigenous people have the highest amount of Denisovan DNA from what I've seen. And so we're looking at a group or a community that not only has a high amount of Denisovan DNA, they spend a lot of time with the Denisovan, but they also have a ghost species within them. The Moy Hill site, which is also on my website, actually is evidence of a Homo erectus site in Australia at 120,000 years ago, kind of like the Cerruti Macedon site is evidence here. So there is evidence of another species outside of the DNA evidence as well. So these are the 7 species that I call our cousin species that we lived alongside, and the 7 ghost species that we see in our DNA and where we see them in our DNA. Just because I had said something along these lines, anybody who is giving you shit of, you've only been here 10,000 years, so it's okay that we take your land from you, please remind them that Europeans have only been on the island of Britain for 14,000 years, and Turtle Island Indigenous people have been here for 54,000 years. That is the current dating via DNA and via understanding. So people have been in Turtle Island, and Homo sapiens have been in Turtle Island and Abiyala longer than Homo sapiens have been in the island of Britain. Okay. In fact, we just redated our earliest Homo sapien find in Northern Europe to 45,000 years. And we know that the DNA break between like the mitochondrial Eve, the start of our mitochondrial lines and the start of our patriarchal or Y DNA lines, is 54,000 years ago for Turtle Island Indigenous people and Abiyalan Indigenous people, right? So we predate them. The other thing is when we're talking about things like Siberia DNA and DNA from Asia, there was nobody in Asia when we moved through Asia. We weren't in Asia and left Asia. We moved through Asia, right? The evidence that we have of DNA that correlates between Asia and Turtle Island is backwards migration evidence. It's evidence of a backwards migration. It's not evidence of people were in Siberia and then they came to Turtle Island. It is not evidence of people were in Southeast Asia and living in a community in a nation, and then 30 people from that nation moved on. That's not what the evidence is. It's always evidence of a backwards migration. Let's go down to the next one, right? And we did kind of hit the Homo sapien. Western Hemisphere has had Homo sapien for 50,000 years already. So we can go ahead and talk about science and medicine being indigenous. This is an important thing to me. And actually, I was talking to a very, very close friend of mine who is also a war vet and also an activist and also Indigenous. And she's very, very, large within community. And when we were talking, um, she was saying, I don't like the science, and anything about science. And I was, trying to point out, these are things that are Indigenous, right? Um, Science is a white word, right? Science is an English word, and the thought process of what science is to most people is a very Western thought process, right? And so I want to honor that thought process, not the Western thought process, but the thought process of that word not suiting, right? So while I will state that science and medicine are Indigenous, I want to state that for Indigenous people, science is knowing. Science is breathing. Science is just a way of being, and not in the Western terminology, but in the life ways. Right? Husbandry is science. Taking corn from something the size of wheat to something the size of corn is science. Right? Um, Understanding the land enough to understand how to tend is science. Understanding the usage of fire, understanding the ability to preserve food, all of these things are science. Um, Yet, the word itself is a Western word, right? And so I do want to honor that these are knowings. That I like using the terminology science because I want it in people's head that science is a new thought process within Western thought process, and that it is something that has been with us forever. And it is. It's very much my attempt to try and reclaim the knowledge, right? Instead of, allowing people to steal the knowledge, right? Reclaim a word, reclaim a name. Um, and to make sure that people understand that what was here when Europeans arrived in Turtle Island was absolutely more advanced than what was happening in Europe at the time, right? And so let me go over this a little bit more, but because we're talking about something that to me is Indigenous, we're not just talking about in Turtle Island. We're not just talking about the Western Hemisphere. When we look at science and medicine, we can see that science and medicine goes back at least 2 million years ago. Now, why do I say this? Not necessarily medicine, but science. Why do I say this? So we know that Homo erectus takes the stone tools that that Paranthropus boisei and Homo habilis, created by Paranthropus boisei, used by Homo habilis, are using, and adapts them, right? Adapts the adaptation. Science is, I observe something in nature. I have an idea or hypothesis of what that might mean. I predict what that hypothesis or idea might mean. I test that prediction. And if that prediction proves true, then I have a working theory, right? And if that prediction proves false, then I have to go back to the hypothesis and redo the whole scenario, right? When we take stone tools from expedient hammerstones, cobblestones, and single-edged flakes or blades to the Acheulean hand axe, what we're seeing is science. We're seeing the adaptation of an adaptation. We're seeing the testing. We're seeing I observed something. I have a hypothesis or a theory of or a thought process of what that observation might mean. I test that, I predict it, I test it, I do all these little steps to get to this point. Now, all those little steps might all be rolled into one. Oh, that's something to drink. I bet if I drink it, it'll taste good. All those steps can be rolled into one. And so what we're seeing is our earliest form of science. At 1.5 million years ago is our first evidence of controlled fire. And this is within Homo erectus. So 1.5 million years ago is our first evidence of controlled fire. To get to the point that you can control fire is absolutely science. You have to figure out how to fucking control fire. And that is 100% science. So we see that science predates our species, which means since it predates our species, it is something that we are seeing everywhere, right? Medicine, our earliest evidence is of medicine. So when we're looking at something, a human being in the skeletal record who has an injury that will hold them up, stop them from moving, stop them from getting food, stop them from their ability to do things. Um, and they live through that. What we're seeing is our earliest form of medicine. Now, what this is if I've broken my leg and we don't have medicine or the capacity for it, I'm going to die and I'm going to get left behind and my community is going to move on and I will die of that broken leg, right? Um, Yet, if I've broken my leg, then you can see that that leg mended and I lived through that break and was able to live for another few years after that break. What this shows is that somebody tended to me while that leg was broken so that I could heal, right? Healing doesn't have to be I gave you herbs. It can absolutely be I sat with you, right? Somebody sat there to ensure that that person healed to the point that they were able to subsist. Now, some things show even more than that. Kreb, which is from the Earth Children series by Jean M. All, is based on a find called Shanidar 1. Shanidar 1, the old man of Shanidar, who's a woman, is a find, is one of our earliest Neanderthal finds. And what it is we call this the flower burial a lot of the times. Shanidar 1 is somebody who is buried with a lot of flowers that the skeleton shows that at a younger age, probably late teens, early 20s, there was an injury to the head, to the skull. And part of the skull was caved in. So I believe, if I remember correctly, we're looking at the right side of the skull. So the right side of the skull was caved in, causing deafness, causing blindness in one eye, and causing eventual atrophy of the leg and the arm. Now, to nurse somebody back to health from having their skull caved in is medicine. Now, I can't say for certain what herbs that they utilized, right? Can't say for certain that they utilized herbs. Can't say for certain that they bandaged them up. I would assume because head wounds bleed like a motherfucker. So it's very likely that they put something on there to staunch the bleeding, right? What I can say is that he lived through that injury, or she lived through that injury. I always think of it as Kreb in my mind, but it is female via the DNA. That she lived through that injury. And in living through that injury, she was able to live a long and full life. Shanidar 1 is 50 to 60 when they die. And the injury is thought to have happened earlier in life because of the fact that the arm and leg on, I believe it's the right side again, atrophies. And the atrophying of the arm and leg on the right side takes some time, but the atrophy comes from nerve damage due to the skull damage, right? And so we see that the atrophy from nerve damage due to the skull damage means that they lived for a long time after the injury, and also means that there was some help. So as Shanidar 1 is losing their ability to walk, right, using their ability to hold things, we was here before Sapiens got here. As Shanidar 1 is aging and losing their ability to hold things, losing their ability to walk, it takes help from other people to ensure that Shanidar 1 is able to continue to live. This is one of our earliest evidences of actual medicine where we can see actual staying with somebody. There is a couple of instances of evidence of herbology within Neanderthals. And this evidence is, so we can take the plaque from a fossil's teeth, and in taking the plaque from a fossil's teeth, we can see what they were eating, right? And as we're seeing what they're eating, we can see, what plants they're eating and things like that. There are a couple of finds that the plaque in the teeth show medicinal herbs in the teeth themselves. And these medicinal herbs are bitter herbs. They're not herbs that you're going to use just to eat or to flavor your food, I mean. And they also don't have a caloric content to them. So they're not herbs that you're using because you're starving and you're trying to eat food, right? And so this shows evidence of herb use. And when you look at the finds themselves, you can see correlating evidence of disease processes in the body where the herbs used actually treat those disease processes. So I think in one of them you can see, if I remember correctly, you can see the herb is like a stomach-based herb. And I want to say it's chamomile off the top of my head, but that's just because I don't think it's chamomile. But it's actually an herb that is used for stomach ailments. And when you look at the process of the body, there is evidence of, like, within the teeth and within the bones, there's evidence of stomach ailment. And so we're seeing herbs that are used in correlation with things. So this is the herbal use, I think, was 70,000 years ago, and Shenandoah one is 90,000 years ago. So these are both early evidences of medicine. We have a full foot amputation in Borneo at 31,000 years ago. A full foot amputation means a lot of things. First of all, it means that they had to anesthetize or knock unconscious or severely manage the pain on the individual. If you amputate a lower limb without some form of anesthetic, without some form of pain control or knock them out, you'll kill them from shock. It's not the same with an upper limb. An upper limb is a little bit different in the fact that your body doesn't go, I'm never going to walk again. When your body watches your lower limb be cut off, your brain goes, I'm never going to walk again, right? And so it will send your body into shock. So it shows anesthesia. It shows giving pain medicine in some form. There's also, so the full foot amputation happened 6 to 9 years before death. The female, biologically, Skelly is what they've named her. Skelly was 19 years old at time of death. So in the early to mid-teens, they believe that her foot was amputated, 6 to 9 years, right? They show evidence within the bone that there's no infection. They show evidence that there's no infection within the bone. So the person had to have had antiseptics used on them as well. So herbs in the area that were found are actually antiseptic herbs, meaning they're herbs that will... Antiseptic means anti against septic, which is if you go septic, you die, right? It's infection, right? So they're anti-infections. They're herbs that kill bacteria so that you can actually not die, basically. So Skelly shows evidence of using antiseptic herbs as well as using some form of painkiller. And then and this one's really important to me. I was a radiographer and I've done surgeries, like I've fluorode surgeries. We use, like, it's surgical steel, but we're using tools you'd get off of a hardware shelf, right? If you go into any limbs, any surgery, you're going to see tools for the most part that you're going to see on a hardware shelf. You're going to see, I have seen saws that you would pull off of a hardware shelf. Very literally, right? Like, I mean, I'm sure it's surgical steel because it needs to be surgical steel. And I'm sure you're not finding surgical steel on a Sawzall at the fucking local hardware store. Yet, the similarity is extremely apparent. The style and the design. We currently today know that fuck my brain. I'm so sorry. My brain is having some really serious issues. It has been for the last couple of weeks, which is why I haven't been around a lot. So I'm going to say a couple of words, and they're not going to be the right words, and I'm trying to get to the right word. Obsidian. Obsidian is the right word. Okay, so we know currently for a fact that obsidian can be sharpened to something so fine that the blade of which can cut between cellular structures. It is the only substance on the planet that can be sharpened to such as it's so hard that it can be sharpened to such a fine cut edge that it can cut between cellular structures. They actually will make scalpels out of obsidian heads today for microsurgery because it will cut between the cellular structures. When you look at the foot amputation in Skelly, what you're looking at is a foot amputation, thank you, that was done with obsidian. The cut is so fine that it had to have been done with obsidian. And the heel on it, the bone remodeling on it is so healthy and beautiful. It had to have been done with obsidian. So this is 31,000 years ago in Borneo. This is a full foot amputation done with anesthetic, meaning pain medication that probably knocked them out, and antiseptic, meaning the ability to clean your tools and clean the area and make sure you're giving herbs like a antiseptic herb afterwards, like a don't get like a kind of like an antibiotic herb afterwards, right? So this is 31,000 years ago in Borneo. Most of the articles in the Anthropologists, my field is not full of indigenous people. Just put it that way. Most of them state things like this means that this person was obviously a high-ranking member of society. She was an important member of society. I disagree. In community, especially in indigenous community, especially in pre-thought process communities, our current thought process communities, everybody's of equal importance. Like there's no need for hierarchy, and every member of community is necessary and valued, right? Even if all you're doing is sitting and tending this fire, that means that somebody else can go out and gather water, right? Even if all you're doing is sitting at home, it means that somebody else can leave the home, right? So I would disagree that she had to have been a high-ranking member of community to be of value to the community. I would have to state that she was probably a member of community. This also shows you don't do a perfect foot amputation the first foot amputation you do. Nobody does a perfect surgery the first time they do surgery, especially at a time when nobody's written it down. It's not like you have books. It's not like you can TikTok that shit, right? Like, I mean, I'm pretty sure I could sew somebody up today, but I've been through a lot of medical training, and if I needed to, I could TikTok that shit, right? Like, it's not like you're living in a time and an age where you can go and read a book and maybe perform a decent surgery. You're living in a time and age where you had to have done this before to get to what is essentially a perfect foot amputation, right? This tells me that we're talking about a knowledge within community. And it also tells me that we're likely talking about a knowledge within community that has lasted longer than at least one generation. Most communities, even if you're in a community of 500,000 or 5,000 people, 500 people, sorry, even if you're in a community of 500 people, which is an extremely large community for any prehistoric, pre-city building time, right? Even if you're in a community of 500 people, you're still not going to have a whole lot of foot amputations, right? You're still not going to have a whole lot of practice on cutting people's feet off, right? So it is likely to me that this is a community that is likely larger and that this is a medical practice that has been practiced in this community before. I would state that this is probably somebody who is at least a second generation learning this from somebody else, right? So these are all evidences of medicine within the ancient peoples across the globe. There's plastic surgery in ancient Egypt. They would shave the cheeks and the chins of the higher ranking women. There's all, and like put the skin back, right? There's also a full knee replacement and full hip replacement in mummies in Egypt. This is 5,000, 4,000 years ago. There is a 7,000-year-old amputation of a forearm in the Near East, I think, in the Near East, the Levant area, I think. Maybe I'm off in the space on that one. I don't remember exactly. I just remember that it looks brown in my head when I think about it. So looks like the desert in my head when I think about it. When we're looking at this, we're looking at medicine. Medicine is something that is really in all cultures prior to 400 BC or Common Era. We see medicine really across the board prior to 400 Common Era. We see that the ancient Celts had medical advancements. We see that the Romans had medical advancements. We see that the Greeks had medical advancements. We see that the Egyptians had medical advancements. We see a full foot amputation. We see Chinese medicine that has lasted since Otzi. Otzi's tattoos are all on meridian points that are currently used in acupuncture, and the tattoo ink is made with plant material that has been burned and then made into ink, and the plant material all correlates with the issues that Otzi had, the stomach issues and stuff like that that Otzi had. Otzi's tattoos are absolutely medicine tattoos. This is absolutely an evidence of medicine at 5,000 years ago, right? So we see that medicine is really global. Of course, we see many instances of medicine here in Turtle Island and in Abiyala when the colonizers arrive. It is known and documented by the colonizers when they arrive that they are dealing with communities that have less prevalence of disease. There's very little prevalence of disease. In fact, I think that the only disease prevalences that they have documented or understanding of being here prior to colonization is cancer was still here. Cancer is cells in everybody's body. Whether or not they get activated is what causes cancer, what changes them from non-malignant to malignant, but there's cancer cells in everybody's body. And so that is the only thing that I can see that is a disease process that we actually see here in Turtle Island prior to colonization, or that I've seen in the archaeological record, or that I've seen documentation of. It is documented that the indigenous people here actually lived in extremely clean environments, and they didn't have things like the common cold. Those things have been healed. Those things have been worked with, and we're no longer a part of communal experience, right? Because they have been eradicated within space. This has to do with some very advanced medicine. There's actually some very advanced medicine here. There is surgeries. I've known since I was young, and it really blew my mind that people didn't grasp this one. Marijuana is a great painkiller, and there is a lot of evidence of using marijuana to be able to kill pain for surgeries and things like that prior. And so we definitely see that there is the ability to do surgeries in many different places. We definitely see that there is the ability to heal, advanced healing in many different places here in Turtle Island and Abiyala. Also, a more advanced understanding of the body is seen here in Turtle Island and Abiyala. And so we see that the idea that medicine and science is new is a whitewash. It's really a rewriting of the timeline of humanity. And it's a rewriting in the timeline of humanity on a very Eurocentric viewpoint, because very literally Europe is the only place science and medicine is new. And very literally, the reason that Europe is the only place that science and medicine is new is because Europe was conquered by Rome, and then Rome went monotheistic, and their God said, if you practice medicine, you're questioning me. If you practice science, you're questioning me. You're playing God. If you practice medicine, you can't do those things. And so we see that Europe actually did not allow science and medicine from 400 until roughly, I think the first evidences of really kind of starting again and questioning things again are like 1400, right? So the addition of the ink, it's not necessarily to increase the effectiveness of the acupuncture. The addition of the ink, we still do medicine tattooing today. Medicine tattooing itself. If I have a stomach ailment, and the channels for the stomach are along the front of, I've had stomach ailments for the last couple of years, and I've been doing acupuncture for this. So along the front of the calf here are the channels for the stomach. And so if I am having stomach ailments, and I'm going to use chamomile because it's just the one on my head right now. Chamomile is a good herb for stomach settling, right? So I have a stomach ailment. The channels on the front of my calf are used for stomach ailments, and I know this. And chamomile is used for stomach ailments, and I know this. So as a tattoo worker, as a healer, because this is a healing, not a tattooing, this is a healing, and it is evident that they were reapplied several times, right? You're basically putting the medicine directly into the skin. So you're basically putting the medicine directly into the body. Not only are you working along the meridian that is important for that part, yet you're also adding the medicinal herbs that affect that part. So I'm kind of a double hit at that point, right? Like I'm kind of doubling down on my effectiveness. So that's why they're using those, so that they can kind of double down on their effectiveness. I know that this works and I know that this works. So I'm going to mix them both together and see if these work together, right? And then with Otzi, we can see that his tattoos, you can tell that they were reapplied over and over again. And so you can see that these are issues that he was having over an extended period of time, and that he was seeking treatment for these over an extended period of time and getting treatment for these over an extended period of time. So we can see that science and medicine are things that, no. And ink is, I mean, that's what it was at that point, is ink, right? We can see that science and medicine are really a global phenomena before Christianity starts taking over the globe. Everywhere where Christianity stepped foot, it eradicated science and medicine. And again, medicine is playing God and science is questioning God, right? We see this even in the early forms of Europeans actually bringing science back into their community. Galileo, right? The early scientists coming back into their community were actually killed off, right? Or arrested or harmed, right? You can see that a lot of the medicine, I mean, they killed all their medics, right? That's what the burning times was. Witches aren't priests. Witches are your healers. Witches are your teachers, right? Witches are, because the Druid, the Wicca, this is the healing class. This is your academic class of your Celts, right? This is your scientists. This is your healers. This is your teachers. This is those who keep the histories. These are those who keep the laws. So when they're killing witches, what they're killing is the healers. What they're killing is the scientists. And they're very much killing them for healing, for science, right? They're very much killing them in so many methods. You will hear she practiced healing on that woman, and that woman's husband got pissed off, and so they reported them, right? Very, very modern parallel, right? So what you're seeing is the eradication of science and medicine in spaces that the Christian church takes over. This is very specifically Christianity. This is not Islam. Islam allows science and medicine the entire time. And for a long time, you will see that people who live in European spaces that do not allow science and medicine will actually go to Islamic communities and learn from the scientists there and the medical people there. They also were not allowing the cutting open of the body still. Like, we're not seeing the cutting open of the body happen between after 400 until much later, right? Yet we do see that science and medicine is still practiced in Islam at this period of time. And so because science and medicine is still practiced in Islam at this period of time, we are absolutely seeing how it actually translates, or how you're getting people leaving Europe to go to Islam to learn science and medicine and bring it back. We see that this eradication of this knowledge, right, it happens for a long period of time. And so when they decide to bring it back, and they're fighting against bringing it back, of course, Europeans being so Eurocentric in it, they're not seeing that this is something elsewhere. I think we've gone over pretty much the entire list. I'm going to set for questions for a couple, see if there's any other things. I know people came in after I went over some things. If there's things that need to be gone over again, I'm totally down for it. And I probably have more information. I'm just, like I said, my brain has been having issues lately. And because my brain is just, like, I can't string words together for some reason. It's been really weird. I'm trying. So there might be more information that I typically give that I can't even think of at this moment of time. So any questions are welcome, because they will help me. And also to get out as much information as possible. is done taking off my nails. I do know that there are some people that came in a little bit later. So if there's anything that you have heard that you question, or you're not exactly sure what the cover was, or what the topic on it was, or what was being said on it, I'm absolutely open for that. Come on, do what I want you to do. And then I'm probably going to take off soon because I have been going for a couple of hours and my brain reaches its max point at some point, and I become a little bit more discombobulated than I already am discombobulated. Yes, absolutely. Well, and if you think of it, the fact that you lose an entire species almost in an ecosystem is going to change the ecosystem, especially when you're talking about a species that's so impactful to the ecosystem. Beaver dams are actually really impactful to the ecosystem in a positive way because the beaver dams create pools for fish. They create still water for other wildlife, right? And so they're very impactful. And when we see Europeans come and start the beaver fur trade, right? We see that this basically eradication of the beaver, basically it's almost an extinction of the beaver. It's not quite, right, but it takes them down quite a bit. And we see that that eradication actually does. It changes all of it. It changes all of it. It changes the river systems. And if you think about it, this makes sense, right? So if I have a river that, God, I can't remember the width that decides between a creek and a river, or a creek, or, but if I have a river and that river has been dammed by a beaver, I have a pond up above the dam, most likely. This is a still water area. You're going to find more fish in this area, especially the smaller fish are going to be in this area. You might find more frogs in this area, more tadpoles. Some of these baby creatures, like it's easier for them in still water than it is in swift water. And so the dam creates the stillwater pond. Not only does it create the stillwater pond, but over time it will actually create tributaries of the river, right? It'll actually, like, well, there's just too much water here. I'm just going to go around. Well, I can't go around that way. I'm going to go around this way. So I'm going to start a new tributary, right? And so when the dams are removed because the beavers are gone, the water flowing through means that we're not getting as many stillwater places for things like baby fish and baby frogs, baby animals to survive in. And we're also, because the water's flowing through fast, it's not going to go back down these tributaries next time, right? If I have a tributary that's there because of a dam and the water's moving too fast through, it's not going to go down that tributary anymore, right? And so this changes the entire ecosystem of the river systems. It absolutely happens. And we see, honestly, we see everywhere that human decided that they were going to change the environment, that we've caused this significant change in the environment. Whether that change of the environment was Western-based agriculture, whether it was damming the rivers ourselves, whether it was huge mining systems, right? All of it actually causes some serious climate destruction. And it kind of weirds me out how people don't see destruction as destruction. Like, if I am literally cutting down entire forests, how do you not see that as destruction? Right? Like, what about that lacks destruction in your mind? It's literally an act of destruction. So how is it not destructive? Right? And if I'm literally committing an act of destruction against the environment, then how do you not equate environmental destruction to an act of destruction against the environment? I've destroyed this environment, right? The seventh ghost species came out when we found the seventh species, HLD6, last year. It's only a couple months old. And I don't exactly know where the seventh ghost species is yet because it's such a new one, and it is in the article on HLD6. That article is on my website, the HLD6 article. Let me make sure I know exactly under what new humans. I think. Yes. So, they're calling it a third human lineage. So you can see on my site under new humans, so it's under bibliographies and under new humans in the bibliographies. And there's like 3 articles on HLD6. And I believe, though I can't remember correctly, that it's in the top article that it talks about a 7th ghost species, but it may be in the second article down on that list that it talks about uh, other ghost species. The person in the picture is Denny. Denny was 13 when she died at roughly 90,000 years ago. And Denny is the only hybrid that we have by DNA. We can see in her DNA that her father was a Denisovan and her mother was a Neanderthal. And she was 13 when she died. We don't have a whole lot because we just have a little thigh bone of her. They have new DNA techniques where they can extrapolate what a person looks like from their DNA, and this is the extrapolation of her. She looks a little older in this picture than we would think a 13-year-old would look, mainly because we now know that, like, before 30,000 years ago, we would create this kind of sunscreen on our skin through excessive oils, and then the follicles, or not the follicles of our skin, but the sloughing of our skin, it would create like a layer on our skin, and that would kind of help sunscreen us. And so Denny looks kind of old because she's got this very thick layer of sunscreen basically on her body, or at least in this image. And so Denny is 90,000 years ago, and she was from Denisovan Cave is where they found her thigh bone at. Or Denisova Cave, where they found her thigh bone at. But yes, there's a 7th ghost species is in there. And if you can't find it in there, let me know. Like, if you don't see it in there, let me know. I might have found it somewhere else. I could have sworn it was in that article, but I might have to find a little bit more information for you. Gregory Coyote. Oh, that looks really good. Thank you. I'll take a look at that. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and get out of here. So it's time for what we always do, because we must. So one thing that we didn't really talk about today is some of the unique features of our species. Yeah. Yeah, and it should be in one of those, or I believe it's in the top one. I just know it came out in that article, in one of the articles on that species. I just can't remember exactly which one. Um, we didn't go over some of us, right, as much. Biologically, as a species, we are nurturing and communal. And I say this because of some biological factors. So biologically, we have what we call mandatory midwifery. And mandatory midwifery is the fact that we have to have help giving birth to our children. Um, the shape of our head like this and the shape of our shoulders like this, but they're set opposite. And the shape of our pelvic outlet means that we have to turn our infants, our neonates, twice as they're coming out. So what we do is the nose is facing backwards. We start pulling, we turn them a quarter turn, head comes out side to side, turn it another quarter turn, shoulders come out side to side, nose up, infant comes out. We're the only species that does this. The only other species that has ever done this has been Neanderthal. This means that we have to have somebody help us give birth to our children. And this means that we must have community to give birth. We're the only species on the planet ever that has 5 life stages from neonate to adult of brain development. Snakes hatch and they leave. They need no nurture. They need no mother. They're gone. Horses are done by 2 years old and they can walk when they're born. Same thing with many other animals. The longest childhood of other animals is like 8 years, and I believe it's bonobos. The next longest is elephants, and it's like 5 years. We have from our birth, neonate, to our full brain development, currently 25 years. This extended period of childhood of brain development is actually what makes our brain so malleable and actually what makes us who we are as a species. I mean, it is really everything we are as a species is because of this extended period of brain development. If your brain is developing in its first stage for 2 to 3, yeah, they are, for 2 to 3 years, that gives you more time for more information, right? Till the next step when you have more time for more information. Whales do as well. Whales, I think, are between the elephants and the bonobos. I can't remember whales. I think whales are like 8 or 7. I can't remember. But you're right. Whales are extended in their childhood. Um, when we look at this extended childhood period has to do with brain development and it has to do with our functionality as a species. During this extended childhood, we have to be nurtured. We have to have somebody. A snake can leave. It doesn't need a mom to take care of it. And yet, for the first 10 years of our lives, we're not able to provide our own care. For the first 2 years of our lives, we're not able to feed ourselves. We're not able to eliminate our waste without having help, or we're just going to lay in it, right? So, because of this, we have to have nurture. Studies have proven, there was studies done in the 50s that proven failure to thrive is a thing, which means that not having the nurture of people around you as an infant means you'll die. Very literally, you'll waste away and die. And studies done currently show that community for a child actually needs to be pretty broad. That the healthiest way to raise a child is not in a 2 or 3 parent home, but in a community of like at least 30 people, right? Everybody pitching in and taking care of that child, both for its food needs, both for its its education needs and its clothing needs and its love needs, right? Its knowledge needs. So biologically, we are nurturing and communal as a species. And we currently live in a time where you've been gaslit to believe that loving each other is wrong, that it's okay to put spikes out so homeless people can't sleep, that you shouldn't feed people who are starving. They have laws against it now. And that loving behavior is God behavior, or to be loving is to be like God. And yet God isn't loving on any level. Like Mofo got some issues, right? So we live in a society that has kind of gaslit us of what nurturing and community is, right? While removing them completely. We no longer have a sense of community or a sense of nurture, really. Very many of us, even children, aren't being nurtured by even our parents. Let's be real. Very many of us. And so for a lot of us, this leads to a lot of mental disconnect, right? A lot of depression, a lot of anxiety, a lot of feeling like there's an issue. You might be the issue, you feel like. A lot of feeling like there's something wrong, because there's something wrong, right? And many of us are taught that we're the something wrong. Like, why can't you fit into this shit? This is perfect. We're so advanced. Why can't you fit in, right? And I want you to know from a scientific standpoint that that is a healthy response to an unhealthy society. Your anxiety, your depression, you're feeling that there's a problem, you're feeling that it doesn't work, you're feeling that it doesn't fit, is a healthy response to an unhealthy society. Our society is ill right now. Our society is controlled by people who have no compassion and empathy and who are trying to breed compassion and empathy out, right? So if you are one of the many who feels depressed or anxious or like you're the issue or the problem, if you're one of the many out there who is aware that there is a problem and you just can't put your thumb on it, please understand that this is a very healthy response to a very unhealthy society. You are not the problem. There is nothing wrong with you. There's something wrong with the world around you. The right to life is inherent. We all were given the right to life the moment we drew our first breath. To live, we must have nurture. Failure to thrive, again, is a thing. Which means that just by being alive, you are worthy of being loved, nurtured, and compassion and empathy, right? These are things that are necessary for our species survival. And everybody who has the right to life has the right to these things, has the worth of these things. And everybody who's alive and breathing, who has drawn their first breath, is alive, right? So if you're dealing with those feelings of anxiety and depression and those feelings that there's something wrong, I just want to remind you today that you're not it. You're not the wrong, right? That it is the society around you. And I want to remind you today to give yourself a little bit of grace, a little bit of empathy, a little bit of love, a little bit of compassion, because you are worthy. You don't have to do anything to be worthy. You don't have to function to be worthy, right? You don't have to get out of your house. It's scary the fuck out there, right? You are worthy just by breathing, just by being alive. You're worthy of the things that are necessary for your survival. Everything is. Every animal on this planet is worthy of what is necessary for them to survive, right? So you are worthy just by being alive. And if you can see the problem, you can fix the problem. If you can't see the problem, you can't fix the problem. If you're not aware that there's an issue, you can't fix the issue. Okay? So not only are you worthy because you're alive, if you are aware that there is a problem, your worth increases because you are the only thing that can help us change. We need awareness to change it, right? Great to see you too, Mia. So if you are alive, you're worthy. And you are worthy of love and compassion and grace and empathy. And I have been evaluated for being NPD. I've been evaluated for being BPD. I go through the VA for all my shit, right? And in these evaluations, I looked up what these things are. Every psychological disorder on this planet right now, part of you have a psychological disorder if you have these things thinks there's a problem with the society around you. And I would argue that if you don't think that there is a problem with the society around you, that you do have a psychological disorder. It's so good to see you too. Thank you so much. So if you are not aware that there's an issue, you might have the issue, right? If you're aware, you're necessary. We can't change without that. We can't change without enough people being aware. We can't affect change without enough people being aware that there is a problem that needs to be changed, right? So please give yourself grace and empathy and love today, because you deserve it just by being alive, just by drawing breath. And please give yourself grace in your depression, your anxiety, your feelings that there's a problem in the world, because those are healthy responses to an unhealthy society. It is a healthy response to look at people being unalived in great numbers and feel sadness. If you weren't sad as children are being bombed, there's a disconnect somewhere. So give yourself grace today. Give yourself love today. Remember that biologically we are nurturing and we are communal, and you are worthy of grace and love and empathy. And those of us who are aware are the only ones who can change it. Our worth increases. And that's not a, hey, Sarah, your worth's better. That's your worth increases when you're aware. Your worth increases when you're trying to help, when you're working for community, when you're working for change. Your worth increases. So please take care of yourself, because you are a necessity for change. You are a necessity for healing, and we can't get anywhere else without it. Much love to all of you guys. I'll try and be back in the next day or so. Probably not this weekend, because I tend to take my time with my partner, but probably tomorrow. And we'll see what we talk about then. Take care, everybody. Much love to you. Much love to you. So seriously, much love to you. Take care. Have a great day, everybody. Watch me as I try to figure out how to turn TikTok off. You haven't figured out by now, I shit at electronics. Bye, YouTube. Much love to you.